Great Fortunes, and How They Were Made. By James Dabney McCabe. Chapter 1. E-Text Gutenberg Online Distributed Proofreading Team. Note: D to Command becomes a trader in Philadelphia, marries Mary Lum. Unfortunate issue of the marriage capture of Philadelphia by the British. Early commercial life of Stephen Girard, how he earned his first money, and the use he made of it. Aid from St. Domingo, his rigid attention to business, thoroughness of his knowledge. One of his letters of instructions his subordinates required to obey orders though they ruin him. Anecdote of Girard, and one of his captains, his promptness and fidelity in business. He never breaks his word. How he lost $500, buys the old Bank of the United States and becomes a banker, cuts down the salaries of his clerks, refuses his watchman an overcoat. Indifference to his employees. Contrast between his personal and business habits. His liberality in financial operations. He subscribes for the entire government loan in 1814 and enables the United States to carry on the war. His generosity toward the government. The suspension of specie payments. Financial troubles. How Girard saved his own notes. His public spirit. How he made $500,000 on a captured ship. Personal characteristics. Why he valued money. His ambition. His infidelity. Causes of the defects of his character. A favorable view. Heroic conduct of Stephen Girard during the prevalence of the yellow fever in Philadelphia. The Good Samaritan. He practices medicine and congratulates himself that he has killed none of his patients. His industry. Visit of Mr. Baring to Mr. Girard. A curious reception. Failing health and death of Stephen Girard. His will. His noble bequests. Establishment of Girard College. Chapter 2. John Jacob Aestir. Legitimate business. The field of success. Reasons for claiming Aestir as an American birth and early life. Religious training. The village of Waldorf. Poverty. The jolly butcher. Young Aestir's repugnance to his father's trade. Unhappy at home. Loses his mother. His desire to emigrate to the new land. Leaves home. His voyage down the Rhine. Reaches London and enters the service of his brother. His efforts to prepare for emigration. Learns to speak English. Peace between the United States and Great Britain. The road to the new land. Open. Aestir sets out for America. His first ventures in commerce. The voyage. How he proposed to save his Sunday clothes. Arrival in the Chesapeake. The ice blockade. Aestir makes a friend. The fur trader's story. Aestir sees the way to fortune. Reaches New York. His first situation. Learning the business. His method of proceeding. An example to young men. His capacity for business operations. He is promoted. His journeys to Canada and their results. Sets up in business for himself. The fur trade of North America. A survey of the field of Aestir's operations. His capital. His tramps into the wilderness in search of furs. Predictions as to the future settlement of the country. His first consignment to England. His marriage. A good wife. Improvement in his prospects. Buys his first ship. The secret of his success. Close attention to business. His economical habits. His endorsement disputed by a bank clerk. Statements of the profits on furs. He engages in the Chinese trade. How the government aided the early China traders. Amount made by Aestir in his legitimate business. His real estate operations. His foresight and courage. How $8,000 yielded $80,000. His real estate in the city of New York. Purchases the half of Putnam County. The Roger and Mary Morris estate controversy. Aestir wins his suit and makes $500,000. Aestir's scheme of colonization. A grand enterprise. Settlement of Astoria. Betrayed by his agents, and the scheme brought to failure. Aestir withdraws from active business. His boyhood's vow and its fulfillment. Builds the Aestir house. His voyage to Europe. The return. The troubles of a millionaire. The great man seasick. A curious draft. The last years of his life. His fondness for literary men. His death and burial. His will. Opposite views of his character. How his refusal to buy a chronometer cost him $70,000. He remembers an old friend. His gift of a lease. His humor. William has a rich father. Chapter 3. Alexander T. Stewart. Birth and early life. Becomes his grandfather's war. Designed for the ministry. A change in his plans. Comes to America. Teaches school in New York. Becomes a dry goods merchant. Receives a legacy. His first importation. How he began business. An energetic trader. His sample lots and their history. Success of his enterprise. He begins by encouraging honesty in trade. Wins a name for reliability. The system of selling at one. Chapter 4. Amos Lawrence. The Lawrence family. A poor boy. Early education. Delicate health. Obtains a situation at Dunstable. Returns to Groton. Becomes Mr. Brazer's apprentice. The variety store. An amateur doctor. Importance of Groton in old times. Responsibility of young Lawrence is put in charge of the business. High character. Drunkenness. The curse of New England. Lawrence resolves to abstain from liquors and tobacco. His self-command completes his apprenticeship, visits Boston, an unexpected offer enters. Into business in Boston, is offered a partnership, but declines it. His sagacity justified, begins business for himself. Commercial importance of Boston aid from his father, a narrow escape lesson for life. Amos Lawrence's method of doing business, an example for young men. His business habits, he leaves nothing unfinished over Sunday, avoids speculation. His views upon the subject, introduces double entry in bookkeeping into Boston. His liberality to his debtors does not allow his business to master him. Property gained by some kinds of sacrifice is not worth having. Forms a partnership with his brother Abbott. Business of the firm, they engage in manufactures. Safe business principles, a noble letter. Political opinions, his charity statement of his donations, requests that no public acknowledgement of his gifts be made. Character as a merchant and a man, advice to his son. His religious character, loss of his health, his patience and resignation. The model American merchant. Chapter 5. Andrew V. Stout. Early struggles, acquires an education, undertakes the support of his family. The boy teacher, hard work, is made instructor of Latin. A trying position, how he conquered his difficulties, is made principal of a public school. His first business ventures, engages in the building of houses. His platform of integrity, his success, a great mistake, he endorses a note, the consequence of a false step. Liberal action of the bank. Mr. Stout resolves to accept no accommodation, pays the notes, and loses $23,000. Establishes himself as a wholesale boot and shoe dealer. Enters the dry goods trade. Close attention to business, his system and its success. Organization of the Shoe and Leather Bank of New York. Mr. Stout is made vice president and subsequently president. Character as a citizen, is made city chamberlain. Generosity to the police force, interest in church affairs, kindness to the poor, encouragement which his career affords others. Chapter 6. Jonas Chickering. The largest building in the United States, the Chickering Piano Factory. Birth of Jonas Chickering. Early love of music, is apprenticed to a cabinet maker, is employed to repair a piano, succeeds in the undertaking. Consequence of this success, becomes a piano maker, removes to Boston, is employed as a journeyman. The labor of his life, his patience and skill, is known as the best workman in the establishment. History of the piano. Chickering's first discovery, his hope of success based on intelligence, becomes a master of the theory of sound. His studies and their result makes an improvement in the framing of pianos, invents the circular scale for square pianos, generously makes his invention free, a noble gift to the world. His business operations increase in the demand for his instruments. Death of Captain Mackay. Mr. Chickering undertakes the sole charge of his affairs. Fears of his friends. Magnitude of the business, the lawyer's question answered, the mortgages paid. Rapid success of Mr. Chickering, his varied duties. Sharp competition, a bogus Chickering, how a Boston bank lost his custom. His independence in business, his character as a merchant, trains his sons to succeed him in business. The result of his efforts, the present house of Chickering and Sons. Destruction of the factory, offers of aid. Mr. Chickering's kindness to his workmen, sets to work to re-establish his business. The new factory begun. Sudden death of Mr. Chickering. Chapter 7. Nicholas Longworth. The grape interest of the United States. Growing demand for American wines. Instrumentality of Mr. Longworth in producing this success. Early life of Mr. Longworth. Apprenticed to a shoemaker, removes to South Carolina, returns to Newark and studies law. Removes to Cincinnati, admitted to the bar. His first case is paid in whiskey stills, and trades them for lands which make his fortune. Rapid growth of Cincinnati, the oldest native inhabitant of Chicago. Longworth's investments in real estate. Immense profits realized by him. His experiments in wine growing. History of the Catawba grape. Longworth decides to cultivate it entirely. His efforts to promote the grape culture in the Ohio Valley. Offers a market for all the grape juice that can be brought to him. The result of his labor seen in the Ohio vineyards of today. His wine cellars. Amount of wine made annually by him. The process used, how sparkling Catawba is made. Longworth's experiments with strawberries. His liberality. Gift of land to the observatory. His challenge to a grumber. Estimate of his character. His eccentricities. His generosity to his tenants. How he made money by helping others to grow rich. His politics. How he subscribed $100 to elect Clay. His hatred of vagabondage. His stone quarry. How he provided it with laborious. His system of helping the poor is charged with stinginess. The devil's poor personal appearance. The hard times overcoat charity to a millionaire. Death of Mr. Longworth. Chapter 8. George Peabody. Birth and parentage, early education, his first lessons in business, an apprentice in a country store, youthful ambition, a desire for change, the visit to Post Mills, removal to Newburyport, reasons for his attachment to that place, his first patron, Peabody goes south, a soldier in the War of 1812-15. A young merchant, a change of prospects, a partner in the house of Riggs and Peabody, Peabody's business capacity, an irregular banker, his reputation as a businessman, promising opening of a brilliant career, retirement of Mr. Riggs, growth of the business, a branch house in London, Mr. Peabody saves the credit of the state of Maryland, tribute from Edward Everett, success in London, a model American merchant, establishment of the house of George Peabody and Company, of the 4th of July dinner, the exhibition of 1851, patriotism of Mr. Peabody, how he saved the United States from humiliation, admission of the London Times of Mr. Peabody's business habits, his economy, adventure with a conductor, finds a conscientious hackman, personal simplicity, visits to the United States, his munificent donations, his last visit, returns to London, and dies, honours paid to his memory, the funeral ceremonies, his burial at Peabody, statement of his donations and bequests, his example encouraging to the young. 2. Capitalists. Chapter 9. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Staten Island, 76 years ago, the establishment of the Staten Island Ferry, birth of Cornelius Vanderbilt, his boyhood, defective education, a famous rider, his early reputation for firmness, superintends the removal of a ship's cargo at the age of 12, how he pawned a horse, becomes a boatman, how he bought his boat, a disastrous voyage, his life as a boatman, his economy and industry, earns $3,000, the alarm at Fort Richmond, Vanderbilt's perilous voyage for aid for the forts, his marriage, his first contract, how he supplied the harbor defenses, builds his first schooner, his winter voyages, becomes a steamboat captain, his foresight, leases the hotel at New Brunswick, the dangers of navigating the New York waters, the steamboat war, how Captain Vanderbilt eluded the sheriff, becomes manager of the steamboat line, declines an increase of salary, only wants to carry his point, refuses to buy Mr. Gibbons's interest in the steamboat company, and builds his own boat, narrow escape from ruin, final triumph, systematic management of his vessels, how he ruined the Collins line, the North Star, becomes a railroad director, how he foiled a plan to ruin him, dishonest legislature, Vanderbilt's triumph, his gift to the government, his office in New York, Vanderbilt in business hours, personal characteristics, love for horses, his family. Chapter 10. Daniel Drew. Birthplace, birth and parentage, a farmer's boy, goes to New York to seek his fortune, becomes a cattle drover, leases the Bull's Head Tavern, his energy and success in his business brings the first Western cattle to New York, helps a friend to build a steamboat, the fight with Vanderbilt, Drew buys out his friend and becomes a steamboat owner, Vanderbilt endeavors to discourage him, he perseveres, his success, formation of the People's Line on the Hudson River, the floating palaces, forms a partnership with George Law and establishes the Stonington line, opening of the Hudson River Railway, Drew's foresight, room enough for the locomotive and the steamboat, buys out the Champlain Company, causes of his success as a steamboat manager, becomes a banker, his success in Wall Street, endorses the acceptances of the Erie Railway Company, his courage and calmness in the panic of 1857, he saves Erie from ruin, elected a director of the Erie Road, is made treasurer, his interest in the road, his operations in Wall Street, his farm in Putnam County, joins the Methodist Church, his liberality, builds a church in New York, founds the Drew Theological Seminary, estimate of his wealth, his family, personal appearance. Chapter 11. James B. Deeds. Birth, childhood fondness for machinery, early mechanical skill, constructs a steam engine at the age of 9 years, his workshop, death of his father, works his way to St. Louis, sells apples on the streets, finds employment and a friend, efforts to improve, becomes a clerk on a Mississippi steamer, undertakes the recovery of wrecked steamboats, success of his undertaking, offers to remove the obstacles to the navigation of the Mississippi, failure of his health, retires from business. Breaking out of the war, summoned to Washington, his plan for the defense of the Western rivers, associated with Captain Rogers in the purchase of gunboats, his first contract with the government, undertakes to build 7 ironclads in 65 days, magnitude of the undertaking, his promptness, builds other gunboats during the war, the gunboat fleet at Forts Henry and Donelson, the private property of Mr. Eads, excellence of the vessels built by him, a model contractor, residence in St. Louis. Chapter 12. Cyrus W. Field. Birth, parentage, early education, goes to New York in search of employment, obtains a clerkship in a city house, and in a few years becomes a partner. A rich man at 34 retires from business travels in South America, meets Mr. Gisborne. Plan of the Newfoundland Telegraph Company. Mr. Field declines to embark in it, conceives the idea of a telegraph across the Atlantic Ocean. Correspondence with Lieut. Maury and Professor Morse. The scheme pronounced practicable. Mr. Field secures the operation of 4 New York capitalists. Organization of the New York, Newfoundland, and London Telegraph Company. Building of the line from New York to St. John's. A Herculean task. The governmental ocean surveys of the United States and England. Efforts to secure aid in England. Liberal action of the government. Organization of the Atlantic Telegraph Company. A hard-won success in America. Passage of the bill by Congress. The first attempt to lay the cable. The expedition of 1857. The telegraph fleet. Scenes on board. Loss of the cable. Failure of the expedition. Difficulties remedied. The new paying out machinery. The expedition of 1858. The second attempt to lay the cable. Dangerous storm. Failures. Loss of the cable. The third attempt. The cable laid successful. Messages across the Atlantic. Celebrations in England and the United States. The signals cease the cable. A failure. Discouraging state of affairs. Courage of Mr. Field. Generous offer of the British government. Fresh soundings. Investigations of the Telegraph Board. Efforts of Mr. Field to raise new capital. Purchase of the Great Eastern. The fourth attempt to lay the cable. Expedition of 1865. Voyage of the Great Eastern. Loss of the cable. Efforts to recover it unsuccessful. What the expedition demonstrated. Efforts to raise more capital. They are pronounced illegal. The new company. The fifth attempt to lay the cable. Voyage of the Great Eastern. The cable laid at last. Fishing up and splicing the cable of 1865. The final triumph. Credit due to Mr. Field. 3. Inventors. Chapter 13. Robert Fulton. Trinity Churchyard. The Livingston Vault. An interesting place. Fulton's tomb. Birth of Robert Fulton. Boyhood. Early mechanical skill. Robert astonishes his tutor. Robert's fireworks. A nothing is impossible. Quicksilver Bob. The fishing excursion. The first paddle-wheel boat. Fulton's success as an artist. His gift to his mother. His removal to England. Intimacy with Benjamin West. Goes to Devonshire. Acquaintance with the Duke of Bridgewater. His interest in canal navigation. His first inventions. Goes to Paris. Residence with Mr. Barlow. Studies in engineering. Invents the diving boat. The infernal machine. His patriotic reply to the British ministry. His marriage. Returns to America. The general government declines to purchase his torpedo. Brief history of the first experiments in steam navigation. Fulton's connection with Livingston. The trial boat on the Seine. Determines to build a boat on the Hudson. Fulton and Livingston are given the sole right to navigate the waters of New York by steam. Popular ridicule. Disbelief of scientific men. Launch of the Claremont. The trial trip. The first voyage up the Hudson. Fulton's triumph. Scenes along the river. Efforts to sink the steamer. Establishment of steam navigation on the Hudson River. The first New York ferryboats. The floating docks. Boats for the West New York threatened by the British fleet in 1814. Fulton's plan for a steam frigate. The Fulton I. The steamboat war. Illness of Fulton. His death and burial. His last will. True character of his invention. Chapter 14. Charles Goodyear. Discovery of India rubber. Mode of collecting it. Preparation and use by the natives. Its introduction into the United States. Mr. E. M. Chaffee's process. The India rubber fever. Brief success of the India Rubber Companies. Their sudden failure. Visit of Mr. Goodyear to New York. He invents an improvement in the life preserver. Early history of Charles Goodyear. His failure as a merchant. Offers his invention to the Roxbury Company. The agent's disclosures. Mr. Goodyear finds his mission. His first efforts. A failure. Discouraging state of his affairs. Renews his efforts. Experiments in India rubber. Coldness of his friends. His courage and perseverance. Goes to New York. Accidental discovery of the aqua fortis process. Partial success. Ruined life on Staten Island. Removes to Boston. Delusive prosperity. The mail bag contract. His friends urge him to abandon his efforts. He refuses. On the verge of success. Discovers the usefulness of sulfur. The inventors hope. The revelation discovers the secret of vulcanization. Down in the depths. Kept back by poverty. A beggar. A test of his honesty. Starvation at hand. The timely loan. Removal to New York. Difficulties in the way. Death of his youngest child. Finds friends in New York. His experiments in vulcanization. Final success. His heart in his work. Fails to secure patents in Europe. His losses from dishonest rivals. Declaration of the Commissioner of Patents. Death of Mr. Goodyear. Congress refuses to extend his patent. His true reward. Chapter 15. Eli Whitney. The home of General Greene in Georgia, the soldier's widow and arrival from New England, the young schoolmaster, a mechanical genius. Early history of Whitney. Mrs. Greene's invitation visit of the planter's state of the cotton culture in 1792. A despondent planter, Mrs. Greene, advises them to try Whitney. Origin of the cotton gin. Whitney's first efforts. His workshop. The secret labors. How he provided himself with materials. Finds a partner. Betrayal of his secret. He is robbed of his model. He recovers it and completes it. The first cotton gin. Statement of the revolution in the cotton culture of the South. Opinion of Judge Johnson. The story of an inventor's wrongs. Whitney is cheated and robbed of his rights. The worthlessness of a patent. A long and disheartening struggle. Honorable action of North Carolina Congress refuses to extend the patent. Whitney abandons the cotton gin. Engages in the manufacture of firearms. His improvements in them. Establishes an armory in Connecticut and makes a fortune. Death. Chapter 16. Chauncey Jerome. The old-fashioned clocks. Their expensiveness. Condition of the clock trade of Connecticut 60 years ago. Early history of Chauncey Jerome. A hard life. Death of his father. Becomes a farmer's boy. Is anxious to become a clockmaker. An overwise guardian. Hardships of an apprentice. How Jerome became a carpenter. Hires his winters from his master. Becomes a dial maker. The clockmaking expedition. Jerome's first savings. Takes a wife. A master carpenter. Poor pay and hard work. Buys a house. A dull winter. Enters Mr. Terry's factory. The wooden clock business. Sets up in business for himself. Industry and energy rewarded. His first order. Sends his clocks south. Enlarges his business. Improvements in his clocks. Losses on southern shipments from dampness. Depression of business. Jerome's anxiety. A wakeful night. Invention of the brass. A new era in the clock trade. Beneficial effects of Jerome's invention. Magnitude of the Connecticut clock trade at present. Growth of Jerome's business. Makes a fortune. Organization of this Jerome Clockmaking Company. Practical withdrawal of Mr. Jerome. Difficulties of the company. Jerome, a ruined man. Honest independence. Finds employment. Becomes the manager of the Chicago Company. Chapter 17. Elias Howe, Jr. The first sewing machine. Birth of Elias Howe. A poor man's son. Raised to hard work. His first employment. The little mill boy. Delicate health. Goes to Lowell to seek his fortune. Thrown out of employment. Removes to Cambridge. Works in a machine shop with N.P. Banks. Marries a rash step. Growing troubles. A hard lock. Conceives the idea of a sewing machine. His first experiments unsuccessful. Invents the lock stitch and perfects the sewing machine. Hindered by his poverty. A hard struggle. Finds a partner. His winter's task. His attic workshop. Completion of the model. Perfection of Howe's invention. Efforts to dispose of the invention. Disappointed hopes. Popular incredulity. Becomes an engine driver. Amasa Howe goes to England with the sewing machine. Bargain with the London merchant. Elias removes to London. Loses his situation. The rigors of poverty. Returns to America. Death of his wife. Fate's last blow. The sewing machine becomes better known. Adoption by the public. A tardy recognition. Elias Howe sets up in business for himself. Buys out his partner's interest. The sewing machine war. Rapid growth of the sewing machine. Interest. Earnings of the inventor. A royal income. Honors conferred upon him. Enlists in the United States Army. A liberal private. Last illness and death. Chapter 18. Richard M. Hoe. Growth of the art of printing. Birth of Richard M. Hoe. Sketch of the career of Robert Hoe. He comes to America. His marriage. Founds the house of Robert Hoe and Company. The first steam printing presses. He retires from business. Richard M. Hoe is brought up in the business. The mechanical genius of the house. The new firm. Richard Hoe's first invention. Obtains a patent for it. Visits England. Invents the double-cylinder press. Demand for increased facilities for printing. Mr. Hoe's experiments with his press. His failures. How the lightning press was invented. A good night's work. Patents his invention. The first lightning press. Demand for it. Rapid growth of the business of the firm. Statement of the operations of the house. Personal characteristics of Richard M. Hoe. The lightning press. That work. Chapter 19. Samuel Colt. Birth and parentage. A restless boy. Dislikes school. Early fondness for mechanical inventions. Is sent to boarding school. Runs away to see the story of a boy's invention and what came of it. Origin of the revolver. Returns home. His chemical studies. Dr. Colt. The lecturing tour. His success. Completes his design for the revolver. Patents his invention. Visits England. Discovery at the Tower of London. Returns home. Formation of the Patent Arms Company. Objections of the officers of the Army. and Navy to the revolver the Florida War. It is decided by the revolver triumph of Colonel Colt, cessation of the demand for arms, failure of the company, beginning of the Mexican War, action of General Taylor. No revolvers to be had. A strange dilemma for an inventor. The new model contracts with the government. Success of the revolver in Mexico. The demand from the frontier. Emigration to California and Australia. Permanent establishment of Colonel Colt's business. The improved weapon builds a new armor. Description of his works at Hartford. A liberal employer. Other inventions of Colonel Colt: his submarine telegraph, his fortune, his marriage, visits to Europe, attentions from European dignitaries, witnesses the coronation of the Emperor of Russia, his last illness and death. Chapter 20. Samuel F. B. Morse. Birth, parentage, early education. Graduates at Yale College. Becomes an artist. His master's. Visits England. His first attempt. The Dying Hercules. Opinion of Benjamin West. Wins the medal of the Adelphi Society of Arts. Ambition as an artist. His cold reception by the Americans. Mr. Tuckerman's comments. Organizes the National Academy of Design. Visits Europe the second time. The homeward voyage in the Sully. News of the experiments at Paris with the electromagnet. How the electric telegraph was invented. Morse is made a professor in the University of New York. Completion of his model, an imperfect telegraph. His first experiments. The duplicate finished. First exhibition of the telegraph. Morse applies for a patent. Visits Europe to introduce his invention. His failure. Seeks aid from Congress. A disheartening effort. A long struggle. Independence of Morse. Despondent at last. A sudden lifting of the cloud. The experimental line. The trial. A curious cabinet minister. Success of the telegraph. Establishment of companies in the United States. Professor Morse wins fame and fortune. The telegraph in Europe. Honors at home and abroad. A list of his rewards. Morse originates submarine telegraphy and predicts the laying of an Atlantic telegraph. Personal characteristics for publishers. Chapter 21. James Harper. The brothers Harper. Birth and parentage of James Harper. The Long Island home. James Harper goes to New York. Becomes a devil, winning his way. How he gave his car to a stranger. Arrival of brother John. Good habits. Sets up for himself J. and J. A. Harper, printers. How they started in business. Integrity rewarded. First job. Their first effort at stereotyping. The Harpers become publishers on their own account. Their early ventures. Feeling their way to success. Their publications. Character of their books. How they drove the yellow covers out of the market. Their prosperity. Admission of new partners. The great fire. Destruction of the establishment of Harper and Brothers. Energy of the firm. Re-establishment of their business. Their new premises. Description of the buildings. Personal characteristics of Mr. James Harper. Religious life. Liberality of sentiment. His industry. Elected mayor of New York. Kindness to his operatives. Physical vigor. The Lord knows best. Accident to Mr. Harper and his daughter. His death. Chapter 22. James T. Fields. The Old Corner Bookstore in Boston and its associations. Carter and Ben D. employ a new clerk. Birth and early life of James T. Fields. His literary talent. Governor Woodbury's advice. Enters mercantile life. Determined to rise. His studies. The result. Associated with Edward Everett at the age of 18. His business talent. Steady promotion. Becomes head clerk with Allen and Ticknor. Establishment of the firm of Ticknor and Fields. Success as a publisher. High character of his house. Relations toward authors. Publications of Ticknor and Fields. Removal. Organization of the firm of Fields, Osgood and Company. The new bookstore. An elegant establishment. Mr. Fields' literary success. Statement of a friend. Common sense. His contributions to the periodicals of the firm. Travels in Europe. Personal appearance. V. Editors. Chapter 23. James Gordon Bennett. Birth intended for the Romish priesthood. How he was induced to come to America. Arrival in Halifax. Comes to the United States. What came of a shilling employment in Boston. Reaches New York. Attempts to establish a school. Becomes connected with the press. Success of his Washington letters. Services on the Courier, an Inquirer. Leaves that journal. Removes to Philadelphia. Establishes the Pennsylvanian. Ingratitude of his political associates. Returns to New York. Establishment of the New York Herald. Early difficulties of that paper, and how Bennett surmounted them. The first Herald office. A determined effort to succeed. First numbers of the Herald. How one man carried on a newspaper. A lucky hit. The first money article. The office burned down. The Great Fire. Bennett's reports of the disaster. Success of the Herald. His first advertising contract. Increasing prosperity. The Journal of Today. How it is conducted. The New Herald office. Bennett's pride in his paper. Personal characteristics. His independence. Chapter 24. Robert Borner. Birth and parentage. Emigration to America. Becomes a printer, a first-class compositor engaged upon the Evening Mirror. The Merchant's Ledger. Borner purchases the paper, and changes its name to the New York Ledger. The new literary journal. Predictions of failure. Borner, confident of success, engages Fanny Fern to write for him a handsome. Chapter 25. John Marshall. The model American lawyer. Birth and early life of John Marshall, a devoted father. Early education. The young patriot. Troubles with England. Marshall becomes a soldier. The Culpeper Minutemen. Marshall's popularity in the army. Finishes his law studies. His journey from Williamsburg to Philadelphia. Commences the practice of the law. Elected to the legislature. Establishes himself in Richmond. The power of a powdered wig and velvet coat. Marshall's services in the Virginia Convention of 1798. Becomes the champion of Washington's administration. Refuses public honors. Is made minister to France. Public reception in New York. Elected member of Congress. His memorable speech. Enters the cabinet of President Adams. As Secretary of State. Is made Chief Justice of the United States. His record. His life of Washington. Personal characteristics. His generosity. William Wright's pen and ink sketch of him. His courtesy and kindness. Fondness for manly sports. The Coit Club. How he carried a proud man's turkey home. The supper part of the Chief Justice. Loses the wager. Mode of traveling on his circuit. The scene at Maguire's Hotel in Winchester, Virginia. The unknown champion of Christianity. A brilliant defense. Last illness and death of Judge Marshall. Chapter 26. James T. Brady. Birth and early life. His big head. His kindliness of disposition. Enters his father's office to study law. Merry nature. How he studied law. A model for ambitious youths. His father's opinion of him. Admitted to the bar. His first case. The Newsboy case. Sudden rise in popularity. Practices in the Supreme Court. The India rubber suit. A compliment from Daniel Webster. Brady's integrity, professional success and generosity. His readiness in managing his cases. Conduct toward witnesses. His fearlessness. A bold declaration in Tammany Hall. His profound knowledge of his profession. His industry. His disinterested kindness. His humor meets his match. Political life. Personal appearance. A genial old bachelor. Literary tastes and labors. His generosity to the poor. Devotion to his relatives. Last appearance in public. Forebodings. Death. 7. Artists. Chapter 27. Benjamin West. A native of Pennsylvania. Circumstances attending his birth. The child of promise. First indications of genius. The baby's portrait. Lessons from the Indians. The box of colors. The truant pupil. The mother's discovery. West's opinion of his first picture. The little portrait painter. The first attempt at historical painting. The death of Socrates. Choosing a profession dedicated to his work. A fighting Quaker. Establishes himself in New York. Visits Europe. Arrival at Rome and reception. Their visit to the Apollo Belvedere. West's criticism. Travels and labors on the continent. Visits England. His reception. Their urge to stay. Decides to make England his home. Sends for his bride. Marriage. Agrippina landing with the ashes of Germanicus. Success of the picture. The king becomes his friend. The most famous works of Benjamin West. The death of Wolfe. Reception of the picture by the public. West triumphs over the critics and inaugurates a new era of historical painting. Death of the King. West is elected president of the National Academy. His resignation and re-election. Closing years of a great career. Personal appearance. Leigh Hunt's description of him. Death. Burial in St. Paul's Cathedral. Chapter 28. John Rogers. Birth. Early years. Begins life as a clerk in a dry goods store. Artistic talent. Opposition of his parents. A change in his plans. Becomes an engineer. Failure of his eyes. Voyage to Spain. Return home. Becomes a machinist. Promoted. Learns to model in clay. Commences his studies in art. A hard life and a noble perseverance. A change for the better. A sudden reverse. Out of work. Visits Europe to study his art. Returns home in despair. Enters the service of the surveyor of the city of Chicago. His first statuettes. Their success. A new field open to him. Visits New York and learns the new method of casting figures. Establishes himself in New York. His first studio. Immediate popularity of his works. Description of them. Removes to a new studio. His later works. Process by which they are made. Originality of the artist rewarded by the public. Personal characteristics. Chapter 29. Hiram Powers. Birth. Juvenile mechanical skill. The life of a Vermont boy. Hard times. Removal of the Powers family to the west. The new farm. Misfortunes never come. Singular breaking up of the household. Hiram's first employment. The reading room scheme. Hiram becomes a collector of bad debts. Reminiscences of the Young West Powers becomes a mechanic story of the brass plates. Rapid promotion. The silver watch, how Hiram purchased it. The Cincinnati Museum, the artist's first lessons in modeling. His first sitter. The trial of skill. The king of the Cannibal Islands, the man-eater. Hiram becomes interested in the museum, how he played the devil in Cincinnati. A dishonest employer. Mr. Longworth's offer. Powers goes to Washington. His success there. Visit to Old Hickory. The first critic. Kindness of Senator Preston. Powers goes to Italy. Arrival in Florence. His first works in Italy. Visit to Thorwaldsen. Works of Powers. His rapid success. His life in Italy. Views of Mr. Powers respecting an artist. Life. Personal characteristics. Popularity with artists. Chapter 30. Emanuel Lutz. An American by adoption. Early life and education. How he learned to draw. Becomes an artist. His first picture. The evils of too much haste. His first professional engagement. Despondency. A ramble through the Virginia woods, and what came of it. A friend in need. Greater success. Friendship of Mr. Carey. Lutz goes to Europe. Studies at Dusseldorf. His reception there. Becomes Lessing's pupil. His first picture. Finds a purchaser. Travels and studies in Europe. Returns to Dusseldorf. Marries and makes his home in that place. His paintings. Returns to New York. Success in America. The government commission. Journey to the Rocky Mountains. The great fresco in the Capitals. Westward. The Star of Empire takes it way. Revisits Dusseldorf. Reception by the artists. Returns to the United States. Further commissions from the government. His sudden death. His unfinished works. Mr. Tuckerman's remarks. 8. Divines. Chapter 31. Henry Ward Beecher. A Connecticut boy. The minister's family. A gloomy childhood. Ma'am Kilbourne school. The loss of his curls. The dull boy. A bad voice for an orator. His first religious impressions. Aunt Esther. The Sunday catechism. Sent to boarding school. Love of nature. Enters his sister's school. The hopeless case. An inveterate joker and an indifferent scholar. Removal to Boston. Gets through the Latin school. The seagoing project. Dr. Beecher's ruse. Life at Mount Pleasant. Conquers mathematics. Embraces religion at a revival. Resolves to become a minister. Removal to Cincinnati. Course at the Lane Seminary. How he learned to preach. Marries his first charge. Life at Lawrenceburg. Removal to Indianapolis. Life in the West. His popularity. His theory of preaching and its success. Conversion of his brother. Mr. Beecher accepts a call to Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. Political record. Literary labors. Pastoral work. A large audience. Government of Plymouth Church. Description of the edifice. The congregation. The services. Mr. Beecher as a preacher. Sympathy between the pastor and his hearers. His ideas of religion. How he prepares his sermons. His prayers. Unstudied. The social receptions. The Friday evening meeting. A characteristic scene. Labors during the war. Visit to Europe. An unpopular sermon in a good cause. Personal characteristics. Chapter 32. Peter Cartwright. Birth. Removal to Kentucky. Rogues Harbor. Condition of the country and the people. Frontier life. Early life of a preacher. Becomes a Christian. His account of his conversion is made an exhorter in the Methodist Church. Removal to Lewiston. Counter. Begins preaching. Qualifications of a backwoods preacher. His energy. The jerks. How Peter frightened a bully. A brimstone angel. Enters the ministry. Appointed to the Marietta Circuit. A good school. Hard times. Marries quiet heroism. How the old-time people married. His devotion to the Methodist Church. Troubles with other denominations. How he argued with a Universalist. How he met a wrathful dame. Encounter with a Baptist preacher. Adventure with Father Teal. Taming a shrew. Removal to Illinois. His reasons for taking that step. Death of his daughter. Arrival at his new home. Life on the frontier. A large district. The Methodist Circuit. Riders of 60 years ago. Perils of frontier traveling. Success of Cartwright's ministry. How he was superannuated. His courage. How he cleared a camp of rowdies. Encounter on a ferryboat. Frightens a bully. Advocates. Temperance. A practical joke. Is elected to the legislature. His opinion of politics. How Chapter 2. He raised the devils. Another sinner down. Missionaries from the East. Indignation of the backwoods preacher. The proposed mission to New England. Cartwright declines it. He visits Boston. His reception. How he preached for Father Taylor. Summing up 67 years of a preacher's life. 9. Authors. Chapter 33. Henry W. Longfellow. Birth and early life. The Old House by the Sea. College life. Early literary productions. Becomes a professor in Bowdoin College. Travels in Europe. Marriage. Literary labors. Outre is made a professor in Harvard College. His second visit to Europe. Death of his wife. Goes to live in the Craigie House. Historical associations. Washington's headquarters. A congenial home. Literary labors. A Hyperion. Great popularity of the book Voices of the Night. The Spanish student Mr. Longfellow buys the Craigie House summary of his works The Song of Hiawatha, Death of Mrs. Longfellow. Mr. Longfellow again visits Europe. His popularity with the English-speaking race, cause of his popularity, resignation seen from The Golden Legend, The Poet's Home. Chapter 34. Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Hawthornes of Salem. A seagoing race. Birth of Nathaniel Hawthorne. A sad home. Early life. His college days. Longfellow's recollection of him. Returns home. The young recluse. Literary efforts. Twice Told Tales. The most unknown author in America. Enters the Boston Custom House. His duties. Popularity with the sailors. Loses his office. Becomes a member of the Brook Farm community. Marries and goes to live at Concord. The old man's life at Concord. Curiosity of the village people. Mosses from an Old Manse. Hawthorne's visitors. Hawthorne and his friends. George William Curtis. Recollections. Removes to Salem. Is made surveyor of that port. The Scarlet Letter. Removal to the Berkshire Hills. The House of the Seven Gables. Returns to Concord. A life of Franklin Pierce. Is made consul to Liverpool. Life abroad. Depressed by the war. Moncure D. Conway's recollections. Juvenile works. Death of Mr. Ticknor. Effect upon Hawthorne. Goes traveling with ex-President Pierce. Sudden death of Hawthorne. Burial at Concord. X-Factors. Chapter 35. Edwin Booth. The elder Booth. His success as an actor. His son's birth. Of Edwin Booth. Early life. Brought up on the stage. Admiration for his father. Travels with him. First appearance. Appears frequently with his father. Plays Richard III. In New York. A bold venture. Learns the details of his profession. Visits Australia and the Sandwich Islands. Reappearance in New York in 1857. Recollections of him at that time. His labors in his profession. Successful tours throughout the country. Visits England. Appears at the Haymarket Theatre in London. Studies on the continent. Appearance at the Winter Garden. The Shakespearean Revivals. Destruction of the Winter Garden by fire. Loss of Mr. Booth's theatrical wardrobe. Popular sympathy. The new theatre opening of the building. Description of Booth's theatre. A magnificent establishment. A splendid stage. Novel mode of setting the scenes. Magnificent mounting of the plays produced there. Mr. Booth's performances. Personal genius as an actor. Beneficial influence upon the drama. Chapter 36. Joseph Jefferson. The Jefferson family. A race of actors. Jefferson I of Old Jefferson. Jefferson III. Birth of Joseph Jefferson. Childhood. Brought up on the stage. Olive Logan's reminiscence. First appearance in public. Early training. Career as a stock actor. Becomes a star. His success. Visits Australia. The Players' El Dorado. Pecuniary success of Jefferson in Australia. His merits as an actor. Visits England. First appearance at the Adelphi Theatre. Our American Cousin production of Rip Van Winkle makes the part his specialty. Description of his performance of Rip Van Winkle. Personal characteristics. Devotion to his profession. Love of art. A capital sportsman. Buys a panorama. A visit to John Sefton the Golden Farmer. Private life. 11. Physicians. Chapter 37. Benjamin Rush. Birth and early life. Adopts medicine as a profession. Studies in Europe. Returns home and is made a professor in the Philadelphia Medical College. Political career. Elected to the Provincial Conference of Pennsylvania. Action with respect to the independence of the colonies. Elected to the Continental Congress. Signs the Declaration of Independence. Marriage. Is made Surgeon General of the Army. Becomes Physician General. Troubles. Resigns his commission. Letters to the people of Pennsylvania. Services in the state conventions. Resumes his practice in Philadelphia. Plans the Philadelphia dispensary. Resumes his professors. Chair the yellow fever in Philadelphia. A scene of terror. The 100 Days. Dr. Rush's treatment of the disease. Opposition of the faculty. Success of Rush's treatment. Testimony of Dr. Ramsey. Suit for damages. Dr. Rush services during the fever. Reminiscences. Honors from European sovereigns. Is made Treasurer of the United States Mint. Literary labors. Zeal in behalf of Christianity. His connection with the Bible Society. Death. Chapter 38. Valentine Mart. Birth. Early life. Enters Columbia College. His medical studies. Continues his studies in Europe. Great surgical genius. His early success as an operator. Returns home. Is made professor of surgery in Columbia College. His career and success as a teacher. Introduces the system of clinical instruction. Difficulty of procuring subjects for dissection. Desperate expedients. Midnight adventure. A ready rebuke. Success and skill as a surgeon. Tribute from Sir Astley Cooper. A wonderful operation. Sketch of his original operations. His mode of operating. Careful preparation. Success as a physician. A progressive mind. Professional honors. Visits Europe. Reception abroad. Operates upon the Sultan of Turkey. A cool proposition. Personal. His last illness and death. President Lincoln murdered. Merchants. Chapter 1. Stephen Girard. One May morning, in the year 1776, the mouth of the Delaware Bay was shrouded in a dense fog, which cleared away toward noon, and revealed several vessels just off the capes. From one of these, a sloop, floated the flag of France and a signal of distress. An American ship ran alongside the stranger, in answer to her signal, and found that the French captain had lost his reckoning in a fog, and was in total ignorance of his whereabouts. His vessel, he said, was bound from New Orleans to a Canadian port, and he was anxious to proceed on his voyage. The American skipper informed him of his locality, and also apprised him of the fact that war had broken out between the colonies and Great Britain, and that the American coast was so well lined with British cruisers that he would never reach port, but as a prize. "What shall I do?" cried the Frenchman, in great alarm. "Enter the bay, and make a push for Philadelphia," was the reply. "It is your only chance." The Frenchman protested that he did not know the way, and had no pilot. The American captain, pitying his distress, found him a pilot, and even loaned him $5, which the pilot demanded in advance. The sloop got under way again, and passed into the Delaware, beyond the defenses which had been erected for its protection, just in time to avoid capture by a British war vessel which now made its appearance at the mouth of the bay. Philadelphia was reached in due time, and, as the war bade fair to put an end to his voyages, the captain sold the sloop, and her cargo, of which he was part owner, and, entering a small store in Water Street, began the business of a grocer and wine bottler. His capital was small, his business trifling in extent, and he himself labored under the disadvantage of being almost unable to speak the English language. In person he was short and stout, with a dull, repulsive countenance, which his bushy eyebrows and solitary eye, being blind in the other, made almost hideous. He was cold and reserved in manner, and was disliked by his neighbors, the most of whom were afraid of him. This man was Stephen Girard, who was afterward destined to play so important a part in the history of the city to which the mere chances of war sent him a stranger. He was born at Bordeaux, in France, on the 21st of May, 1750, and was the eldest of the 5 children of Captain Pierre Girard, a mariner of that city. His life at home was a hard one. At the age of 8 years, he discovered that he was blind in one eye, and the mortification and grief which this discovery caused him appear to have soured his entire life. He afterward declared that his father treated him with considerable neglect, and that, while his younger brothers were sent to college, he was made to content himself with the barest rudiments of an education, with merely a knowledge of reading and writing. When he was quite young, his mother died, and, as his father soon married again, the severity of a stepmother was added to his other troubles. When about 13 years of age, he left home, with his father's consent, and began, as a cabin boy, the life of a mariner. For 9 years he sailed between Bordeaux and the French West Indies, rising steadily from his position of cabin boy to that of mate. He improved his leisure time at sea, until he was not only master of the art of navigation, but generally well informed for a man in his station. His father possessed sufficient influence to procure him the command of a vessel, in spite of the law of France which required that no man should be made master of a ship unless he had sailed 2 cruises in the Royal Navy, and was 25 years old. Gradually Girard was enabled to amass a small sum of money, which he invested in cargoes easily disposed of in the ports to which he sailed. 3 years after he was licensed to command, he made his first appearance in the port of Philadelphia. He was then 26 years old. From the time of his arrival in Philadelphia he devoted himself to business with an energy and industry which never failed. He despised no labor, and was willing to undertake any honest means of increasing his subsistence. He bought and sold anything, from groceries to old junk. His chief profit, however, was in his wine and cider, which he bottled and sold readily. His business prospered, and he was regarded as a thriving man from the start. In July, 1777, he married Mary Lum, a servant girl of great beauty, and something of a virago as well. The union was an unhappy one, as the husband and wife were utterly unsuited to each other. 7 years after her marriage, Mrs. Girard showed symptoms of insanity, which became so decided that her husband was compelled to place her in the state asylum for the insane. He appears to have done everything in his power to restore her to reason. Being pronounced cured, she returned to her home, but in 1790 he was compelled to place her permanently in the Pennsylvania hospital, where, 9 months after, she gave birth to a female child, which happily died. Mrs. Girard never recovered her reason, but died in 1815, and was buried in the hospital grounds. Girard fled from Philadelphia with his wife, in September 1777, at the approach of the British, and purchased a house at Mount Holly, near Burlington, New Jersey, where he carried on his bottling business. His claret commanded a ready sale among the British in Philadelphia, and his profits were large. In June 1778, the city was evacuated by Lord Howe, and he was allowed to return to his former home. Though he traded with the British, Girard considered himself a true patriot, as indeed he was. On the 27th of October, 1778, he took the oath of allegiance required by the state of Pennsylvania, and renewed it the year following. The war almost annihilated the commerce of the country, which was slow in recovering its former prosperity, but, in spite of this discouraging circumstance, Girard worked on steadily, scorning no employment, however humble, that would yield a profit. Already he had formed the plans which led to his immense wealth, and he was now patiently carrying out the most trying and disheartening preliminaries. Whatever he undertook prospered, and though his gains were small, they were carefully husbanded, and at the proper time invested in such a manner as to produce a still greater yield. Stephen Girard knew the value of little things, and he knew how to take advantage of the most trifling circumstance. His career teaches what may be done with these little things, and shows how even a few dollars, properly managed, may be made to produce as many thousands. In 1780, Mr. Girard again entered upon the New Orleans and Street Domingo trade, in which he was engaged at the breaking out of the Revolution. He was very successful in his ventures, and was enabled in a year or two to greatly enlarge his operations. In 1782, he took a lease of 10 years on a range of frame buildings in Water Street, one of which he occupied himself, with the privilege of a renewal for a similar period. Rents were very low at that time, as business was prostrated and people were despondent, but Girard, looking far beyond the present, saw a prosperous future. He was satisfied that it would require but a short time to restore to Philadelphia its old commercial importance, and he was satisfied that his leases would be the best investment he had ever made. The result proved the correctness of his views. His profits on these leases were enormous. About this time he entered into partnership with his brother, Captain John Girard, in the West India trade. But the brothers could not conduct their affairs harmoniously, and in 1790 the firm was dissolved by mutual consent. Stephen Girard's share of the profits at the dissolution amounted to $30,000. His wealth was greatly increased by a terrible tragedy which happened soon afterward. At the outbreak of the great insurrection in St. Domingo, Girard had 2 vessels lying in one of the ports of that island. At the first signal of danger, a number of planters sent their valuables on board of these ships for safekeeping, and went back to their estates for the purpose of securing more. They never returned, doubtless falling victims to the fury of the brutal Negroes, and when the vessels were ready to sail there was no one to claim the property they contained. It was taken to Philadelphia, and was most liberally advertised by Mr. Girard, but as no owner ever appeared to demand it, it was sold, and the proceeds, about $50,000, turned into the merchant's own coffers. This was a great assistance to him, and the next year he began the building of those splendid ships which enabled him to engage so actively in the Chinese and East India trades. His course was now onward and upward to wealth. At first his ships merely sailed between Philadelphia and the port to which they were originally destined, but at length he was enabled to do more than this. Loading one of his ships with grain, he would send it to Bordeaux, where the proceeds of her cargo would be invested in wine and fruit. These she would take to St. Petersburg and exchange for hemp and iron, which were sold at Amsterdam for coin. From Amsterdam she would proceed to China and India, and, purchasing a cargo of silks and teas, sail for Philadelphia, where the final purchase was sold by the owner for cash or negotiable paper. His success was uniform, and was attributed by his brother merchants to luck. Stephen Girard had no faith in luck. He never trusted anything to chance. He was a thorough navigator, and was perfect master of the knowledge required in directing long voyages. He understood every department of his business so well that he was always prepared to survey the field of commerce from a high standpoint. He was familiar with the ports with which he dealt, and was always able to obtain such information concerning them as he desired, in advance of his competitors. He trusted nothing of importance to others. His instructions to the commanders of his ships were always full and precise. These documents afford the best evidence of the statements I have made concerning his system, as the following will show. Copy of Stephen Girard's letter to Mr. Commander and supercargo of the ship, bound to Batavia, Philadelphia. Sir, I confirm my letters to you of the ultimate, and the FINST. Having recently heard of the decease of Mr. Merchant at Batavia, also of the probable dissolution of his house, under the firm of Messrs., I have judged it prudent to request my Liverpool correspondents to consign the ship, cargo, and specie on board, to Mr. Merchant at Batavia, subject to your control, and have requested said Liverpool friends to make a separate invoice and bill of lading for the specie, which they will ship on my account, on board of the ship, and similar documents for the merchandise, which they will ship in the same manner. Therefore, I request that you will sign in conformity. I am personally acquainted with Mr., but not with Mr., but I am on very friendly terms with some particular friends of the latter gentleman, and consequently I give him the preference. I am sorry to observe, however, that he is alone in a country where a partner appears to me indispensable to a commercial house, as well for the safety of his own capital as for the security of the interests of those who may confide to them property, and reside in distant parts of the globe. The foregoing reflections, together with the detention of my ship V. at Batavia from June last, epoch of her arrival at that port, until the 15th of September, when she had on board only 1900 peckles of coffee, are the motives which have compelled me to request of my Liverpool friends to consign the specie and goods, which they will ship on my account, on board of the ship, under your command, to said Mr., subject to your control. Therefore, relying upon your activity, perseverance, correctness, zeal, and attention for my interest, I proceed in pointing out to you the plan of conduct which I wish you to pursue on your arrival at Batavia, and during your stay at that, or any port of that island, until your departure for Cowes, on the Isle of Wight, to await my subsequent orders. First, on your arrival at Batavia, you are to go on shore and ascertain Mr. S. residence, and, if you have reason to believe that he is still considered at that place as a man of good credit, and merits full confidence, you are to deliver to him my Liverpool consignees' letters to his address, and also the goods which you have on board, in such proportion as he may request, except the specie, which is to continue on board, as mentioned in the next article. Second, the specie funds of the ship, which will consist of old Carolus dollars, you are to retain on board untouched, and in the said boxes or packages as they were in when shipped from Liverpool, well secured, and locked up in your powder magazine, in the after run of the said ship under the cabin floor. The bulkhead and floor of said magazine, scuttle, iron bar, staples, etc., must be made sufficiently strong, if not already so, while you are at Liverpool, where you are to procure a strong padlock and key, for the purpose of securing said specie in the most complete and safest manner, and when you have the certainty that it is wanted to pay for the coffee purchased on account of the ship, then you are to receive the said coffee, and pay, or deliver to your consignee Spanish dollars to the amount of said purchase, and no more, having due regard to the premium or advance allowed at Batavia on old Spanish dollars, and in that way you are to continue paying or delivering dollars as fast as you receive coffee, which is not to exceed the quantity which can be conveniently stowed on board said ship, observing to take a receipt for each payment, and to see that the net proceeds of the goods, which will have been shipped at Liverpool, must be invested in coffee, as far as the sales will permit, and shipped on board of said ship. Should it happen that on your arrival at Batavia you should find that death, absence, etc., should deprive you of the services of Mr., or that, owing to some causes before mentioned, it would be prudent to confide my interests elsewhere, in either case you are to apply to Messrs., merchants of that place, to communicate your instructions relative to the disposal of the Liverpool cargo, on board of the ship, the loading of that ship with good merchantable coffee, giving the preference to the first quality whenever it can be purchased on reasonable terms for cash, or received in payment for the sales of the said Liverpool cargo, or for a part thereof, observing that I wished said coffee to be purchased at Samarang, or any other outport, if practicable, and in all cases it must be attentively examined when delivered, and put up in double gunny bags. If the purchase of said cargo is made at an outport, the ship must proceed there to take it in. On the subject of purchasing coffee at government sales, I have no doubt that it is an easy way to obtain a cargo, but I am of opinion that it is a very dear one, particularly as the fair purchaser, who has no other object in view but to invest his money, does not stay on the footing of competitors, who make their payments with Netherland bills of exchange, or wish to raise the Chapter 2. John Jacob Astor. Those who imagine that the mercantile profession is incapable of developing the element of greatness in the mind of man, find a perfect refutation in the career of the subject of this memoir, who won his immense fortune by the same traits which would have raised him to eminence, as a statesman. It may be thought by some that he has no claim to a place in the list of famous Americans, since he was not only German by birth, but German in character to his latest day. But it must be borne in mind that America was the theater of his exploits, and that he owed the greater part of his success to the wise and beneficent institutions of the New Land, as he termed it. In his own country he would have had no opportunity for the display of his great abilities, and it was only by placing himself in the midst of institutions favorable to progress that he was enabled to make use of his talents. It is for this reason, therefore, that we may justly claim him as one of the most celebrated of American merchants. John Jacob Astor was born in the village of Waldorf, near Heidelberg, in the Grand Duchy of Baden, on the 17th of July, 1763. This year was famous for the conclusion of the treaties of Paris and Hubertsburg, which placed all the fur-yielding regions of America, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Frozen Sea, in the hands of England. He was the youngest of 4 sons, and was born of Protestant parents. He was early taught to read Luther's Bible and the Prayer Book, and throughout his whole life remained a zealous Protestant. He was trained to the habit of rising early, and giving the first of his waking hours to reading the Bible and Prayer Book. This habit he continued all through life, and he often declared that it was to him the source of unfailing pleasure and comfort. His religious impressions were mainly due to his mother, who was a pious, thrifty, and hard-working woman, given to saving, and devoted to her family. His father, on the contrary, was a jolly ne'er-do-well, a butcher by trade, and not overburdened with industry. The business of a butcher in so small a village as Waldorf, where meat was a luxury to the inhabitants, was merely a nominal calling. It knew but one season of real profit. It was at that time the custom in Germany for every farmer to set apart a calf, pig, or bullock, and fatten it against harvest time. As that season approached, the village butcher passed from house to slaughter the animal, cure its flesh, or make sausage meat of it, spending, sometimes, several days at each house. This season brought Jacob Astor an abundance of work, and enabled him to provide liberally for the simple wants of his family, but during the rest of the year it was with difficulty that he could make bread for them. Yet Jacob took his hard lot cheerfully. He was merry over his misfortunes, and sought to forget them in the society of companions who gathered at the village beer-house. His wife's remonstrances against such a course of life were sometimes so energetic that the house became anything but a pleasant place for the children. Here John Jacob grew up to boyhood. His brothers left home to earn their livelihood elsewhere, as soon as they were old enough to do so, and he alone remained under the paternal roof. His father destined him for his own calling, but the boy shrank from it with disgust. To crown his misfortunes, his mother died, and his father married again, and this time a woman who looked with no favor upon the son. The newly married pair quarreled continually, and the boy was glad to escape occasionally to the house of a schoolmate, where he passed the night in a garret or outhouse. By daylight he was back at his father's slaughterhouse, to assist in carrying out the meat. He was poorly clad and badly fed, and his father's bad reputation wounded him so keenly that he shrank from playing with other boys, and led a life of comparative isolation. Fortunately for him, he had a teacher, Valentine Jeune by name, the son of French Protestants, who was better fitted for his position than the majority of the more liberally patronized Catholic instructors. He was well taught by Valentine Jeune in the rudiments of a plain education, and the tutor and the Protestant minister of the village together succeeded so well in his religious instruction that at the age of 14 he was confirmed. Confirmation is the decisive point in the career of the German youth. Until then he is only a child. Afterward he is regarded as on the threshold of manhood, and is given to understand that the time has come for him to make choice of a career in life. To the German peasant two courses only lie open, to learn a trade or go out to service. John Jacob was resolved not to do the latter, and he was in no condition to adopt the former. He was already familiar with his father's trade, but he shrank from it with disgust, and he could not hope to obtain money enough to pay for his tuition as an apprentice in any other calling. No workman in the village would receive him as an apprentice for less than $50, and $50 were then further beyond his reach than as many millions in after years. The harvest was approaching, and Jacob Astor, seeing an unusual amount of work in store for him at that season, decided the matter for his son by informing him that he must prepare to settle down as his assistant. He obeyed, but discontentedly, and with a determination to abandon his home at the earliest practicable moment. His chief desire was to leave Germany and emigrate to America. The American Revolution had brought the new land into great prominence, and one of the brothers, Henry Astor, had already settled in New York, as a butcher, and his letters had the effect of increasing John Jacob's desire to follow him. It was impossible to do so then, for the war which was raging in this country made it anything but inviting to an emigrant, and the boy was entirely ignorant of the English language, /1. He knew that the war could not last always, and he resolved to go as soon as peace would allow him. Meanwhile he wished to join his elder brother, who had removed to London, and was now engaged with his uncle in the manufacture of musical instruments. In London he thought he could acquire a knowledge of English, and save from his wages the amount necessary to pay his passage from England to America. He could reach some of the seaports of the continent by walking. But he needed money to pay his passage from there to Great Britain. His determination thus formed, he made no secret of it, and succeeded at length in extorting a reluctant consent from his father, who was not inclined to expect very much from the future career of his son. His teacher, however, had more faith in him, and said to the butcher, on the morning of the lad's departure, "I am not afraid of John Jacob, he'll get through the world. He has a clear head, and everything right behind the ears." He was 17 years old when he left home, was stout and well built, and had a constitution of iron. He was possessed of a good plain education, and a remarkable degree of common sense. He had no vicious habits or propensities, and was resolved that he would never set foot again in his native town until he could do so as a rich man. Ardently as he was bent on seeking his fortune in distant lands, it cost him a struggle to go away, for he was a true German in his attachment to his home and family. This attachment he never lost. After providing liberally for his relatives in his will, he made a munificent donation to his native village for the benefit of its poor children. With his scanty wardrobe in a bundle, which he slung over his shoulder by a stick, and a mere pittance in his purse, he set out from Waldorf, on foot, for the Rhine. "Soon after I left the village," said he, "in after life, I sat down beneath a tree to rest, and there I made 3 resolutions, to be honest, to be industrious, and not to gamble." He had but $2 in his pocket, but this was enough for his purpose. The Rhine was not far distant from his native village, and this part of his journey he easily accomplished on foot. Upon reaching the river, he is said to have secured a place as oarsman on a timber raft. The timber which is cut in the Black Forest for shipment is made up into rafts on the Rhine, but instead of Chapter 3. Being suffered to float down the stream, as in this country, is rowed by oarsmen, each raft having from 60 to 80 men attached to it. As the labor is severe and attended with some risk, the wages are high, and the lot of the oarsmen not altogether a hard one, as they manage to have a great deal of sport among themselves. The amount paid as wages on these voyages is about $10, besides the course fare furnished the men, and the time occupied is about 2 weeks. Upon reaching the Dutch seaport at the mouth of the Rhine, young Aestier received his wages, the largest sum he had ever possessed, and took passage in a vessel for London, where he was welcomed cordially by his brother, and provided with employment in his manufactory. He now set to work to prepare himself for his emigration to America. His industry was unflagging. He worked literally from dawn till dark, and practiced the most rigid economy in his expenditures. His leisure time, which was brief, was spent in trying to master the English language, and in acquiring information respecting America. He had anticipated great difficulty in his efforts to learn English, but succeeded beyond his hopes. In 6 weeks he could make himself understood in that language, and some time before starting for America could speak it with ease, though he never could at any period of his life rid himself of his strong German accent. He was never able to write English correctly, but after being some years in this country acquired a style which was striking and to the point, in spite of its inaccuracy. England, however, was not a favorable place for acquiring information respecting America. The colonies had exasperated the mother country by their heroic struggle for freedom, which was just drawing to its close, and the New World was pictured to the imagination of the young German in anything but a favorable light. His most accurate information was gained from those who had returned from America, and these persons, as often as chance threw them in his way, he questioned with eagerness and precision. Their answers were carefully stored up in his memory. In September 1783, the news of the peace which established the independence of the United States was published in Europe. Young Aestier had now been in London 2 years, and had saved money enough to take him to America. He was the possessor of a suit of good clothes, besides his ordinary wearing apparel, and 15 guineas in English money, which he had saved from his slender earnings by the absolute denial to himself of everything not essential to his existence. The way to America was now open, and he resolved to set out at once. For 5 guineas he bought a steerage passage in a ship bound for Baltimore, and reserving about £5 of the remainder of his capital in money, invested the rest in 7 German flutes, which he bought of his brother, and embarked for the new land. The winter was memorable on land and sea for its severity, and our hero's first voyage was a stormy one. It is said that on one occasion, when the tempest was unusually violent, and the ship in imminent danger, he made his appearance in his Sunday clothes. In reply to those who asked his reason for so strange an act, he said that if he should reach land he would save his best clothes, and that if he was drowned it was immaterial what became of them. Although the ship sailed in November, it did not reach the Chesapeake until near the end of January, and there, when only 1 day distant from Baltimore, was caught in the ice, where it was compelled to remain until late in March. This delay was very vexatious to the young emigrant, but it proved in the end the greatest blessing that could have befallen him. During the voyage Aestier had made the acquaintance of one of his fellow passengers, a German, somewhat older than himself, and, while the ship lay fast in the ice, the two were constantly together. As a consequence of the intimacy which thus sprung up between them, they exchanged confidences, told each other their history, and their purpose in coming to America. Aestier learned that his friend had emigrated to the New World a few years before, friendless and penniless, but that, beginning in a little way, he had managed to become a fur trader. He bought his furs from the Indians, and from the boatmen plying on the Hudson River. These he sold at a small profit to larger dealers, until he had accumulated a considerable sum for one in his position. Believing that he could find a better market in Europe than in America, he had embarked all his capital in skins, which he had taken to England and sold at a heavy advance. The proceeds he had invested in toys and trinkets valued by the savages, and was now on his way back with them, intending to go into the wilderness himself and purchase an additional stock of furs from the Indians. He recommended Aestir to enter upon the same business, gave him valuable information as to the value of peltries in America and in England, told him the best way of buying, packing, preserving, and shipping the skins, and gave him the names of the leading furriers in New York, Montreal, and London. Aestir was deeply impressed with the views of his friend, but he could not see his own way clear to such a success, as he had no capital. His friend assured him that capital was unnecessary if he was willing to begin in an humble way. He could buy valuable furs on the wharves of New York for toys and trinkets, and even for cakes, from the Indians who visited the city, and these he could sell at an advance to the New York dealers. He advised the young man, however, not to be satisfied with the American market, but to work for a position which would enable him to send his furs to England, where they would bring 4 or 5 times as much as in this country. Aestir carefully treasured up all that his friend said to him, and quietly resolved that he would lose no time in entering upon this business, which seemed to promise so much. The two friends traveled together from Baltimore to New York, where they were warmly received by Astor's brother, Henry, who had succeeded in laying the foundation of a prosperous business, as a butcher, in which he afterward made a large fortune. Both brothers were men of business habits, and on the very first evening after the arrival of the newcomer they began to discuss plans for his future. Aestir's friend stated all the advantages of the fur trade, and convinced Henry Aestir that it was a fine field for the energies of his brother, and it was agreed that it would be best for the young man to seek employment in the service of some furrier in the city, in order that he might thoroughly learn the business, and familiarize himself with the country and its customs. To his great delight, young Aestir learned that, so far from being compelled to pay his employer for learning him the business, as in Europe, he would be certain here to receive his board and nominal wages from the first. The next day the three started out, and succeeded in obtaining a situation for the young man in the store of Mr. Robert Bown, a Quaker, and a merchant of long experience in the business, as well as a most estimable man. He is said to have engaged Aestir at $2 per week and his board. Aestir was at once set to work by his employer to beat furs, this method of treating them being required to prevent the moths from lodging in and destroying them. From the first he applied himself to the task of learning the business. He bent all the powers of his remarkable mind to acquiring an intimate knowledge of furs, and of fur-bearing animals, and their haunts and habits. His opportunities for doing so were very good, as many of the skins were sold over Bound's counters by the hunters who had taken them. These men he questioned with a minuteness that astonished them, and the result was that in a few years he was as thoroughly familiar with the animals, their habits, their country, and the mode of taking them, as many of the trappers themselves. He is said to have been in his prime the best judge of furs in America. He appreciated the fact that no man can succeed in any business or profession without fully understanding it, and he was too much determined upon success to be satisfied with a superficial knowledge. He was resolved that there should be no detail in the business, however minute, with which he was unfamiliar, and he toiled patiently to acquire information which most salesmen in his place would have esteemed trivial. Nothing was trivial with him, however, and it is remarkable that he never embarked in any scheme until he had mastered its most trifling details. Few men have ever shown a deeper and more far-reaching knowledge of their profession and the issues involved in it than he. He fully understood that his knowledge would give him a power which a man of less information could not obtain, and he never failed to use that knowledge as a power. His instructions to his subordinates were always drawn up with the strictest regard to details, and show not only how thoroughly he had mastered the subject before him, but also how much importance he attached to the conscientious fulfillment of a well-digested plan of operations. He recognized no such thing as luck. Everything with him was the result of a deliberate plan based upon knowledge. In this respect his career affords one of the best models to be found in our history. Aestir's employer was not insensible to his merits, and soon promoted him to a better place. In a little while the latter entrusted him with the buying of the furs from the men who brought them to the store, and he gave such satisfaction to his employer that he was rewarded with a still more confidential post. Montreal was at that time the chief fur depot of the country, and it was the custom of Mr. Bound to make an annual journey to that city for the purpose of replenishing his stock. The journey was long and fatiguing, and as soon as the old gentleman found that he could entrust the mission to his clerk, he sent him in his place. Ascending the Hudson to Albany, A.S. Deer, with a pack on his back, struck out across the country, which was then almost unsettled, to Lake George, up which he passed into Lake Champlain. Sailing to the head of the lake, he made his way to Montreal. Then returning in the same way, he employed Indians to transport his furs from Lake George to Albany, and dropped down the Hudson in the way he had come. Mr. Bound was delighted with the success of his clerk, who proved more than a match for the shrewd Indians in his bargains. It was doubtless here that Mr. A.S. Deer obtained that facility in driving a hard bargain for which he was afterwards noted. As soon as Mr. A.S. Deer felt himself master of his business, he left the employ of Mr. Bound, and began life on his own account. The field upon which he purposed entering was extensive, but it was one of which he had made a careful survey. Previous to the peace of 1763, the French and English divided the control of the fur-bearing regions of America. The British possessions, extending from Canada to the unexplored regions of the north, had been granted by a charter of Charles II. To Prince Rupert, and were, by virtue of that instrument, under the exclusive control of the Hudson Bay Company. Large quantities of furs were obtained in this region, and collected at the principal settlement, York Factory, from which they were shipped to England. South of this region was Canada, then possessed by the French, who carried on an extensive trade with the Indians, who brought their furs down to Montreal in their birch canoes. The French finally settled in the country of the savages, and married among the natives, thenceforward entirely devoting themselves to the life of the trapper and hunter. These marriages produced a race of half-breeds who were especially successful in securing furs. The cession of Canada to England was a severe blow to the French traders, as it opened the country to the enterprise of the English, a few of whom were quick to avail themselves of its advantages. The French and Indians at first regarded them with hostility, but gradually became reconciled to their presence. Under the French rule the savages had not been furnished with liquors, but the English soon sold whiskey and rum in great quantities to them, receiving the best furs in return. As a consequence, intemperance spread rapidly among the savages, and threatened to put an end to their industry as gatherers of furs. To check the evil results of this irregular trading, a company was established in 1785, called the Northwest Company. It was managed by 12 partners, some of whom resided at Montreal, and others at the trading posts in the interior. Their chief station was at Fort William, on Lake Superior. Here, at stated times, the agents would come up from Montreal and hold a consultation for the purchase of furs. These meetings always drew crowds of French and Indian trappers, boatmen, and others, who brought in large quantities of skins. A few years later a third company was organized, with its principal station at Michilimackinac, near Lake Huron. It was called the Mackinaw Company, and its field of operations was the country bordering Lake Superior, and that lying between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains. The company was English, but did not hesitate to operate in American territory, so little regard did Great Britain pay to the rights of the infant republic. Although peace had been concluded, the frontier forts had not been given up. Oswego, Niagara, Detroit, Michilimackinac, and other posts were still in the hands of the English. The Indian tribes continued hostile, being under English influence. No company had as yet been formed in the United States. Several French houses at St. Louis traded with the Indians, but it was not until 1807 that an association of 12 partners, with a capital of $40,000, was formed at St. Louis, under the name of the Missouri Company. The trade, it will thus be seen, was almost wholly in the hands of the English companies, the Hudson's Bay Company in the north, the Northwest Company in the Canadas, the Mackinaw Company in the territories of the United States, and the few American traders in the field had to rely on their individual resources, with no aid from a government too feeble in its infancy to do more than establish a few Indian agencies, and without constitutional power to confer charter privileges. The voyage of Captain Cook had brought to the notice of the fur dealers of the world the sea otter of the northern Pacific, and the announcement made upon the return of the expedition drew large numbers of adventurers to the west coast of America in search of the valuable skins of these animals. In 1792, there were 21 vessels, principally American, on the coast. It was into this field, already occupied by powerful and hostile corporations, that the young German entered. He was perfectly aware of the opposition his efforts would encounter from them, but he was not dismayed. He began business in 1786, in a small store in Water Street, which he furnished with a few toys and notions suited to the tastes of the Indians who had skins to sell. His entire capital consisted of only a few $100, a portion of which was loaned him by his brother. He had no assistants. He did all his own work. He bought his skins, cured, beat, and sold them himself. Several times during the year he made journeys on foot through western New York, buying skins from the settlers, farmers, trappers, savages, wherever he could find them. He tramped over nearly the entire state in this way, and is said to have had a better knowledge of its geography and topography than any man living. He used to boast, late in life, when the Erie Canal had called into being a line of thriving towns through the center of the state, that he had himself, in his numberless tramps, designated the sites of those towns, and predicted that one day they would be the centers of business and population. Particularly he noted the spots where Rochester and Buffalo now stand, one having a harbor on Lake Erie and the other upon Lake Ontario. He predicted that those places would one day be large and prosperous cities, and that prediction he made when there was scarcely a settlement at Buffalo, and only wigwams on the site of Rochester. During these tramps his business in the city was managed by a partner, with whom he was finally compelled to associate himself. As soon as he had collected a certain number of bales of skins he shipped them to London, and took a steerage passage in the vessel which conveyed them. He sold his skins in that city at a fine profit, and succeeded in forming business connections which enabled him afterward to ship his goods direct to London, and draw regularly upon the houses to which they were consigned. He also made an arrangement with the house of Astor and Broadwood, in which his brother was a partner, by which he became the agent in New York for the sale of their musical instruments, a branch of his business which became quite profitable to him. He is said to have been the first man in New York who kept a regular stock of musical instruments on hand. Slowly, and by unremitting industry, Mr. Astor succeeded in building up a certain business. His personal journeys made him acquainted with the trappers, and enabled him to win their goodwill. The savages sold their skins to him readily, and he found a steady market and a growing demand for his commodities in the Old World. It was about this time that he married Miss Sarah Todd, of New York. She was a connection of the Brevoort family, and was of better social position than her husband. She entered heartily into his business, doing much of the buying and beating of the furs herself. She was a true helpmate to him, and long after he was a millionaire, he used to boast of her skill in judging furs and conducting business operations. In 1794, Jay's Treaty placed the frontier forts in the hands of the Americans, and thus increased the opportunities of our own traders to extend their business. It was of the greatest service to Mr. Astor. It enabled him to enlarge the field of his operations, and, at the same time, to send his agents on the long journeys which he formerly made, while he himself remained in New York to direct his business, which by this time had grown to considerable proportions. He was now on the road to wealth. He had scores of trappers and hunters working for him in the great wilderness, and his agents were kept busy buying and shipping the skins to New York. As soon as he was able to do so, he purchased a ship, in which he sent his furs to London, occasionally making a voyage thither himself. He manifested the greatest interest in the markets of the Old World, especially in those of Asia, and informed himself so accurately concerning them that he was always enabled to furnish his captains with instructions covering the most minute detail of their transactions in those markets, and it is said that he was never unsuccessful in his ventures there, except when his instructions were disobeyed. In this again, as in the fur trade, we see him patiently acquiring knowledge of the Eastern trade before venturing to engage in it. His first step was always to fully comprehend his task, to examine it from every possible point of view, so that he should be prepared to encounter any sudden reverse, or ready to take advantage of good fortune. Here lay the secret of his success, that he never embarked in an enterprise until he had learned how to use it to advantage. Under his skillful management his business grew rapidly, but he avoided speculation, and confined himself to legitimate commerce. He was plain and simple in his habits, carrying this trait to an extreme long after economy had ceased to be necessary to him. He worked hard, indulged in no pleasures except horseback exercise and the theatre, of both which he was very fond. It was only after he had amassed a large fortune that he ever left his business before the close of the day. Then he would leave his counting room at 2 in the afternoon, and, partaking of an early dinner, would pass the rest of the day in riding about the island. So plain was his style of living that, before he became generally known as a wealthy man, a bank clerk once superciliously informed him that his endorsement of a note would not be sufficient, as it was not likely he would be able to pay it in case the bank should be forced to call upon him. "Indeed," said Mr. Astor, "how much do you suppose I am worth?" The clerk named a moderate amount, at which the merchant smiled quietly. "Would the endorsement of Mr. or Mr. be sufficient?" asked Mr. Astor, naming several well-known merchants who lived in great style. "Entirely sufficient," was the reply. "Each one of them is known to be wealthy." "How much do you think each is worth?" The clerk named large sums in connection with each of the gentlemen. "Well, my friend," said the merchant, "I am worth more than any of them. I will not tell you how much I am worth, but it is more than any sum you have named." The clerk looked at him in surprise, and then said, bluntly, "Then you are a greater fool than I took you for, to work as hard as you do." Mr. Astor was very fond of telling this story, which he regarded as one of the best jokes of the day. All this time Mr. Astor had lived over his store, but in 1800, after he had been in business 15 years, he moved his dwelling to 223 Broadway, on the site of the Astor House of today. He lived here, with one removal, for upwards of 25 years. The house was plain and simple, but he was satisfied with it. He was now worth $250,000, and his business was growing rapidly. The fur trade was exceedingly profitable. A beaver skin could be bought from the trappers in western New York for $1 and sold in London for $6.25. By investing this amount in English manufactures, the $6.25 received for the skin could be made to produce $10 paid for the English goods in New York. The Chinese trade was also very profitable. China was an excellent market for furs. They brought high Chapter 3. Alexander T. Stewart. In the year 1818, a European vessel anchored in the harbor of New York, after a long and weary voyage from the Old World. She brought many passengers to the young metropolis, the majority of whom came with the intention of seeking fortunes in this land of promise. Among them was a young Irishman who had left his home in his native land to seek in America the means of bettering his condition. This was Alexander T. Stewart. He was the son of Scotch-Irish parents, and was born in Belfast in 1802. Being only 3 years old when his father died, his grandfather took charge of him, and proved a kind and judicious guardian. As he was designed for the ministry by his relative, and as his own tastes inclined him to that profession, he was given a good common school education, and placed at college, where he made favorable progress in his class. He was particularly successful in the classics, and is said to retain his relish for them at the present day. During his second term his grandfather died, and he was by this event obliged to leave college. Abandoning the idea of entering the ministry, he embarked for America, determined to make a fortune in the New World. he came sufficiently supplied with ready money to insure him against immediate want, and with letters of introduction which at once secured him an excellent social position. After trying in vain for some time to secure employment in a business house, he obtained a position as assistant in a commercial school. This he soon resigned for a similar place in a more celebrated school. His salary here was $300, which was considered ample compensation in those days. Not wishing to continue in this career, however, he opened a small retail dry goods store in New York, and began business on a humble scale. Here he remained until the age of 21, manifesting no extraordinary business capacity, and in no way distinguished from the many small dealers around him. Upon reaching his majority he returned to Ireland, to look after the inheritance left him by his grandfather. The amount which thus came to him was nearly £1,000, and the greater part of this he invested in insertions and scallop trimmings, which he shipped to America by the vessel in which he returned. He rented a little store, on his return, at 283 Broadway, and there displayed his stock, which met with a ready sale at a fair profit. Without mercantile experience, and possessing little advantage, save his own Scotch-Irish energy and courage, Mr. Stewart started boldly on what proved the road to fortune. No young merchant ever worked harder than he. From 14 to 18 hours each day were given to his business. He was his own bookkeeper, salesman, and porter. He could not afford to employ help. Credit was hard to obtain in those days, and young merchants were not favorites with those who had such favors to bestow. Mr. Stewart was one of the least favored, inasmuch as he was almost a total stranger to the business community in which he lived. He kept a small stock of goods on hand, which he purchased for cash chiefly at the auction sales. He was a regular attendant at these sales, and his purchases were invariably sample lots, that is, collections of small quantities of various articles thrown together in confusion, and sold in heaps for what they would bring. He had these purchases conveyed to his store, and after the business of the day was over, he and his wife would take these sample lots, and by carefully assorting them, bring order out of the confusion. Every article was patiently gone over. Gloves were redressed and smoothed out, laces pressed free from the creases which careless bidders had twisted into them, and hose made to look as fresh as if they had never been handled. Each article being good in itself, was thus restored to its original excellence. The goods were then arranged in their proper places on the shelves of the store, and by being offered at a lower Chapter 4. Amos Lawrence. Amos Lawrence was born at Groton, Massachusetts, on the 22d of April, company which sailed from England for the New World under Governor Winthrop in 1630, and which, according to Graham, contained several wealthy and high-born persons, both men and women, who expressed their determination to follow truth and liberty into a desert, rather than to enjoy all the pleasures of the world under the dominion of superstition and slavery. This Lawrence settled in Watertown, and was one of the original proprietors of the town of Groton, which was founded in 1655. Samuel Lawrence, the father of the subject of this memoir, was the fifth in descent from the founder of the family, and was himself a gallant officer of the American army in the War of the Revolution, the close of which found him the possessor of a small farm, which yielded a modest support for his family. Young Amos was brought up on the farm, with none of the advantages of wealth, and with but a limited education, which he gained at the village schools, and which was seriously interfered with by his delicate health. He received his final training at the Groton Academy, to which, in after life, he became a liberal patron. As we children came forward, he wrote, late in life, we were carefully looked after, but were taught to use the talents entrusted to us, and every nerve was strained to provide for us the academy which is now doing so much there. Toward the close of the year 1799, when but a little over 13 years of age, he took his final departure from school, and entered a store in the village of Dunstable, as clerk. He remained there but a few months, and then returned to Groton, where he obtained a place as apprentice in the store of Chapter 4. A Mr. Brazier. This was the largest establishment in the place, and conducted a very important trade with the country for miles around. Boston was so far, and so difficult to reach in those days, that Groton came in for nearly all the business of its vicinity which the railroads have now taken to the city. Mr. Brazer's establishment, which was known as a variety store, came in for the best part of this trade. Everything was sold there: puncheons of rum and brandy, bales of cloth, kegs of tobacco, with hardware and hosiery, shared attention in common with silks and threads, and all other articles for female use. Even medicines were sold there, and Dr. W.M.B. Lawrence, the son of our hero, assures us that his father was obliged to sell medicines, not only to customers, but to all the physicians within a circuit of 20 miles, who depended on this establishment for their supplies. The confidence in his good judgment, he adds, was such that he was often consulted in preference to the physician, by those who were suffering from minor ails, and many were the extemporaneous doses which he administered for the weal or woe of the patient. The Brazer store was a prominent feature in Groton. It was a place of general resort, and close by was the tavern where the mail coaches stopped. Travelers were constantly passing through the town, bringing the news of those stirring days when Napoleon was rushing over Europe with his armies, overturning old states and building up new ones, and changing the destinies of the world. The domestic politics of the day were exciting, and it is likely that they aided, together with the events in the Old World, in imparting to the character of Mr. Lawrence the earnestness and gravity for which he was noted when a mere lad. Mr. Brazer had in his employ a number of clerks, but it was not long before the energy and business talent of young Lawrence made him the most trusted of all. Mr. Brazer did not give much personal attention to the store, and when he found that his young clerk was so admirable and reliable a manager, he left the business entirely in his hands. This was a post of unusual responsibility for one so young, but Amos Lawrence accepted it promptly, and labored to discharge its duties faithfully. He at once established the character for probity and fairness which distinguished him through life. His simple assertion was sufficient in any matter, being received with implicit trust by all who knew him. His duties kept him constantly employed, and though he lived within a mile of his father's house, weeks sometimes passed without giving him the opportunity of visiting it. Drunkenness was at that day the curse of New England. Everybody drank, and such fiery fluids as brandy, whiskey, rum, and gin were the favorites. Men, women, and children were addicted to the vice, and Groton was no exception to the rule. Mr. Brazer's store was famous for the good liquors served out to its customers, and his clerks were aware that their employer did not object to their helping themselves when they felt thirsty. Amos Lawrence fell into the habit to which all were given, and for some time went along with the rest, but at length he came to the conclusion that such indulgence was wantonly ruining his health, and he resolved to abstain entirely. "We 5 boys," said he, years afterward, "were in the habit, every forenoon, of making a drink compounded of rum, raisins, sugar, nutmegs, etc., with biscuit all palatable to eat and drink. After being in the store for weeks, I found myself admonished by my appetite of the approach of the hour for indulgence. Thinking the habit might make trouble if allowed to grow stronger, without further apology to my seniors, I declined partaking with them. My first resolution was to abstain for a week, and, when the week was out, for a month, and then for a year. Finally, I resolved to abstain for the rest of my apprenticeship, which was for 5 years longer. During that whole period I never drank a spoonful, though I mixed gallons daily for my old master and his customers." At the same time, Mr. Lawrence determined that he would not use tobacco in any form. He was very fond of the odor of the weed, and at one period of his life always kept a fine Havana in his drawer that he might enjoy the scent of it, but he was totally free from our disgusting national vice in any of its forms. In this respect, as indeed in all others, he offers a fine example to the rising youth of the present generation. On the 22d of April, 1807, Mr. Lawrence completed his 21st year, and his 7 years' apprenticeship with Mr. Brazer came to an end. He was now of an age to enter into business for himself, and it was his intention to open a small store in Groton, in connection with a brother apprentice, but before doing so he decided to visit Boston for the purpose of establishing a credit. He reached the city with but $20 in his pocket, richer, he subsequently declared, in his own estimation, than he ever felt before or afterward. While in the city, he received the offer of a clerkship from a mercantile house of good standing. It was entirely unsolicited, and took him by surprise, but he decided to accept it, and abandoned his idea of going into business for himself in Groton, and this act led to a career entirely different from that to which he had looked forward. Boston, in 1807, had a population of about 30,000, and the commercial position of the city was relatively much greater than at present. The foreign trade of the United States was enormous, and was carried on in American ships, and not, as at present, in foreign vessels. The total tonnage of American shipping engaged in this trade was 700,000 tons, and of this Boston possessed a fair share. Her domestic trade was also important. The merchants of Boston had then high places in the estimation of the world. The Perkinses, the Sargents, the Mays, the Cabots, the Higginsons, and others, were known throughout the world for their integrity, their mercantile skill, and the extent and beneficial character of their operations. These were the golden days of Boston's commerce. The standard of integrity was high, and though it would be absurd to suppose that there was not the usual amount of evil in the place, it may be assumed that in no part of the world was the young trader more likely to find severer judges of character and conduct, or to be better treated if he should afford unquestionable proofs of capacity and honesty. It was into this community that Mr. Lawrence now entered, and in which his life was spent. He gave such satisfaction to his employers that, when he had been with them a short time, they astonished him with the offer of a partnership. He was but partially acquainted with their affairs, but their manner of conducting their business did not please him, and he declined their offer. His sagacity was verified by the result. In a few months the firm failed, and the creditors appointed him to settle their affairs, which he did to their satisfaction. Being now out of employment, he resolved to commence business on his own account in Boston. He had made such a favorable impression upon the merchants of the city that he had no difficulty in obtaining credit. He rented a store in Cornhill, stocked it with dry goods, and began his career as a merchant. For months after this, his father, who was keenly interested in his son's success, without consulting the latter, mortgaged his farm for $1,000, and, repairing to Boston, placed the money in Amos Lawrence's hands. Mr. Lawrence was profoundly affected by this proof of his father's devotion, but he regretted it none the less, as he knew that his failure would bring ruin to his parent as well as to himself. "I told him," said he, 40 years later, "that he did wrong to place himself in a situation to be made unhappy if I lost the money. He told me he guessed I wouldn't lose it, and I gave him my note." Mr. Lawrence made a prompt use of the money, and paid the mortgage at the proper time, but he had a narrow escape from loss, as the bank on which he had bills for the amount of the mortgage failed almost immediately after he had obtained specie for them. "This incident," he said, "shows how dangerous it is to the independence and comfort of families for parents to take pecuniary responsibilities for their sons in trade, beyond their power of meeting them without embarrassment." Had any Hillsborough bank notes not been paid as they were, nearly the whole amount would have been lost, and myself and my family might have been ruined. The incident was so striking that I have uniformly discouraged young men who have applied to me for credit, offering their fathers as bondsmen, and by doing so I believe I have saved some respectable families from ruin. My advice, however, has sometimes been rejected with anger. A young man who cannot get along without such aid will not be likely to get along with it. He began his business upon principles of prudence and economy, which he rigidly maintained throughout his whole life. He never allowed himself to anticipate his gains, and having fixed his personal expenses at a certain sum, he never went beyond it. His system, which is thus stated by himself, is offered here as a safe and admirable rule for all persons. When I commenced, the embargo had just been laid, and with such restrictions on trade that many were induced to leave it. But I felt great confidence that, by industry, economy, and integrity, I could get a living, and the experiment showed that I was right. Most of the young men who commenced at that period failed by spending too much money and using credit too freely. I adopted the plan of keeping an accurate account of merchandise bought and sold each day, with the profit, as far as practicable. This plan was pursued for a number of years, and I never found my merchandise fall short in taking an account of stock, which I did as often at least as once in each year. I was thus enabled to form an opinion of my actual state as a businessman. I adopted also the rule always to have property, after my second year's business, to represent 40%, at least more than I owed, that is, never to be in debt more than 2.5 times my capital. This caution saved me from ever getting embarrassed. If it were more generally adopted, we should see fewer failures in business. Excessive credit is the rock on which so many businessmen are broken. Mr. Lawrence was very successful from the first. His profits during his first year were $1,500 and over $4,000 during the second. In 7 years he made over $50,000. He paid the closest attention to his business, and nothing could draw him from it in working hours. After these were over he would take his pleasure. His aim was to keep everything in the most complete state possible. During the first 7 years of his business he never allowed a bill against him to stand unsettled over the Sabbath. If he made a purchase of goods on Saturday, and they were delivered to him that day, he always examined and settled the bill by note, or by crediting it, and leaving it clear, so that there should be no unfinished business to go over to the next week, and make trouble for his clerks in case he should not be at his post. Thus, said he, I always kept my business before me, instead of allowing it to drive me. The first years of Mr. Lawrence's mercantile experience covered the darkest period of the history of the Republic. They were marked by the embargo, the crippling of our commerce by the hostility of England and France, and the Second War with Great Britain, in all of which there was much to dishearten a beginner, even if he escaped positive loss. Nothing was certain. The event of a single hour might undo the labor of years, and baffle the best-laid plans. Yet he persevered, and went steadily on to fortune. He was remarkable for his keen foresight, as well as for his prudence, and was always on the alert to profit by the fluctuations of the market. Yet he abominated speculation. He averred that speculation made men desperate and unfit for legitimate business, and that it led them, when under excitement, to the commission of acts against which their cooler judgment would have warned them. The fair profits of legitimate business were, in his opinion, sure to reward any honest and capable man. His aim was to elevate commerce, and not to degrade it. He introduced into Boston the system of double entry in bookkeeping, in advance of any other city merchant. He was prompt and faithful in the performance of every contract, and required a similar course toward himself from all indebted to him, as long as they were able to do so. When they became unfortunate, he was kind and generous, ready to compromise upon the most liberal terms, or to give them their own time for payment, and it is recorded of him that he never dealt harshly with a debtor who had failed in business. As long as such a course was necessary, Mr. Lawrence devoted himself entirely to his business, but after he had placed it on a safe footing, he was careful to reserve to himself time for other duties and for relaxation. No man, he said, had the right to allow his business to engross his entire life. Property acquired at such sacrifices as I have been obliged to make the past year, he wrote at the commencement of 1826, costs more than it is worth, and the anxiety in protecting it is the extreme of folly. He never lost sight of the fact that man is a responsible, intelligent being, placed in the world for other purposes than the mere acquisition of wealth. In October, 1808, his brother, Abbot Lawrence, afterward famous as a merchant and statesman, came to him as an apprentice, and on the 1st of January, 1814, he was admitted to partnership, the style of the firm being A. and A.L. Lawrence. This partnership was terminated only by the death of the elder brother in 1852. Their business was the importation and sale of foreign manufactures, and the firm soon took its place at the head of the Boston merchants engaged in this trade. The tariffs of 1816 and 1824 gave a new and powerful impetus to the manufacture of woolens and cottons in this country, and the Lawrences entered largely into the sale of these goods on commission. In 1830, they became interested in the cotton mills at Lowell, and on the establishment of the Suffolk, Tremorne, and Lawrence companies, as well as subsequently in other corporations, they became large proprietors. From this time their business as selling agents was on the most extensive scale, and their income from all sources large in proportion. They amassed large fortunes, and won names which are the most precious heritage of their children. Perhaps the best exposition of the principles upon which these brothers conducted their commercial operations is found in the following letter from the elder to the younger, written on the 11th of March, 1815, upon the occasion of a visit to England by the latter on business for the firm. My dear brother, I have thought best, before you go abroad, to suggest a few hints for your benefit in your intercourse with the people among whom you are going. As a first and leading principle, let every transaction be of that pure and honest character that you would not be ashamed to have appear before the whole world as clearly as to yourself. In addition to the advantages arising from an honest course of conduct with your fellow men, there is the satisfaction of reflecting within yourself that you have endeavored to do your duty, and however greatly the best may fall short of doing all they ought, they will be sure not to do more than their principles enjoin. It is, therefore, of the highest consequence that you should not only cultivate correct principles, but that you should place your standard of action so high as to require great vigilance in living up to it. In regard to your business transactions, let everything be so registered in your books, that any person, without difficulty, can understand the whole of your concerns. You may be cut off in the midst of your pursuits, and it is of no small consequence that your temporal affairs should always be so arranged that you may be in readiness. If it is important that you should be well prepared in this point of view, how much more important is it that you should be prepared in that which relates to eternity? You are young, and the course of life seems open, and pleasant prospects greet your ardent hopes, but you must remember that the race is not always to the swift, and that, however flattering may be our prospects, and however zealously you may seek pleasure, you can never find it except by cherishing pure principles and practicing right conduct. My heart is full on this subject, my dear brother, and it is the only one on which I feel the least anxiety. While here, your conduct has been such as to meet my entire approbation, but the scenes of another land may be more than your principles will stand against. I say may be, because young men of as fair promise as yourself have been lost by giving a small latitude, innocent in the first instance, to their propensities. But I pray the Father of all mercies to have you in his keeping, and preserve you amid temptations. I can only add my wish to have you write me frequently and particularly, and that you will embrace every opportunity of gaining information. Your affectionate brother, Amos Lawrence. To Abbot Lawrence. In his politics, Mr. Lawrence was a Federalist, and then a Whig. He served for one term in the state legislature as a representative from Boston, with credit to himself, but afterward avoided any active participation in public events. When his nephew by marriage, General Pierce, was a candidate for the presidency, he was very much gratified personally by the selection of the Democracy, but declined to vote for him. In a letter to a friend, written at this time, he said, "I had a charming ride yesterday with my nephew, Frank Pierce, and told him I thought he must occupy the White House the next term, but that I would go for Scott. Pierce is a fine, spirited fellow, and will do his duty wherever placed. Scott will be my choice for President of the United States." Regarding himself as a steward of the riches committed to him, Amos Lawrence was liberal in his charities. During the last 24 years of his life he kept an accurate account of the sums he thus distributed, but with no idea that the statement, which he intended for his own eye only, would ever be made public. During this period he gave away $639,000. The greater part of this was given away in 10 years, and during a period when his average income was $60,000 a year. He was a liberal patron of education, giving large sums to its extension, and it was his delight to assist poor clergymen, without regard to denominations. He gave away clothing, food, books, etc., in large quantities, as well as ready money. 2 rooms in his house, says his son and biographer, and sometimes 3, were used principally for the reception of useful articles for distribution. There, when stormy weather or ill health prevented him from taking his usual drive, he was in the habit of passing hours in selecting and packing up articles which he considered suitable to the wants of those whom he wished to aid. He did not forget the children, and many of his packages contained toys and books and other things calculated to promote their enjoyment. He was beset with beggars of all kinds, many of whom he was compelled to refuse. In his diary, he wrote on the 11th of April, 1849, "Applications come in from all quarters, for all objects." The reputation of giving freely is a very bad reputation, so far as my personal comfort is concerned. It pained him to have his charities made public, and he frequently requested the recipients to say nothing about them. He once made a present of some books to the Johnson School for Girls, and the gift being acknowledged through the columns of a newspaper, he wrote to the principal of the school, "I merely want to say that I hope you will not put me in the newspaper at present, and when my work is done here, if you have anything to say about me that will not hurt my children and grandchildren, say on." To another party he wrote, "I must request that my name be not thrust forward, as though I was to be a by-word for my vanity. I want to do good, but am sorry to be published, as in the recent case." As a merchant, Mr. Lawrence was upright, prudent, far-seeing, sagacious, and courageous. As a citizen, he was patriotic, public-spirited, and devoted, and as a man, he was a sincere, earnest, Christian husband, father, and friend. Viewed in any light, his character affords one of the most perfect models to be found in our history. He was the Christian gentleman in all things, even in the minutest detail of his business. His standard was very high, but he came up to it. Courteous and dignified in manner, with a face handsome and winning in youth, and gentle and benignant in age, he made scores of friends wherever he went, for it was a true index to his character. It is a significant and interesting fact that, during the hottest passages of the old nullification times, although his views were known to be uncompromisingly opposed to the attitude of the South, he never lost the warmest friendship of some of the most advanced of the South Carolina leaders. When one thinks of the friendships that were wrecked amid the passions of those days, this fact speaks volumes for the personal attributes of Mr. Lawrence. He was a true American, proud of his country's past, hopeful for her future, and desiring nothing better than to live and die in the land of his birth. He sent his children abroad that they might see the old world, and profit by the lessons learned there, but he strove earnestly to keep them true to their country. To his son, who was traveling in France in 1829, he wrote, "Bring home no foreign fancies which are inapplicable to our state of society. It is very common for our young men to come home and appear quite ridiculous in attempting to introduce their foreign fashions. It should be always kept in mind that the state of society is widely different here from that in Europe, and our comfort and character require it should long remain so. Those who strive to introduce many of the European habits and fashions, by displacing our own, do a serious injury to the Republic, and deserve censure. An idle person, with good powers of mind, becomes torpid and inactive after a few years of indulgence, and is incapable of making any high effort. Highly important it is, then, to avoid this enemy of mental and moral improvement. I have no wish that you pursue trade. I would rather see you on a farm, or studying any profession. It should always be your aim so to conduct yourself that those whom you value most in the world would approve your conduct, if your actions were laid bare to their inspection, and thus you will be pretty sure that he who sees the motive of all our actions will accept the good designed, though it fall short in its accomplishment. You are young, and are placed in a situation of great peril, and are, perhaps, sometimes tempted to do things which you would not do if you knew yourself under the eye of your guardian. The blandishments of a beautiful city may lead you to forget that you are always surrounded, supported, and seen by that best guardian. He was an eminently just man, and he carried this trait into the little details of his domestic life. His household adored him, and his friends were bound to him by ties unusually strong. He was firm and positive in his own opinions, but he was tolerant of those who differed from him. He was a man of quick, nervous temperament, but he possessed a powerful self-control. He was a sincere and earnest Christian, and while attaching himself to the sect of his choice, his sympathies and aid went out to the whole Christian church. Denominational differences had no place in his heart. He stood on the broad platform of the faith of Christ crucified. During the last years of his life, Mr. Lawrence was a constant invalid. To a man of his temperament this was a great trial, but he bore it unflinchingly, exhibiting, in the long years of feeble health which preceded his death, a cheerfulness and patience which plainly showed the aid of the arm on which he leaned for support. For 16 years he did not take a meal with his family. His food and drink, of the simplest kind, were regularly weighed, a pair of scales being kept in his chamber for that purpose. He wrote to his friend President Hopkins, of Williams College, "If your young folks want to know the meaning of Epicureanism, tell them to take some bits of coarse bread, 1 ounce or a little more, soak them in 3 gills of coarse meal gruel, and make their dinner of them, and nothing else, beginning very hungry, and leaving off more hungry." Mr. Lawrence continued in this condition until December, 1852, when he was seized with a severe attack of the stomachic trouble to which he was a martyr. He died peacefully, on the last day of that month and year, at the age of 66 years, 8 months, and 8 days. He was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, and was followed to the grave by a host of friends who mourned him as a brother, and by strangers to whom his kindness in life had brought relief from many a care and suffering. Chapter 5. Andrew V. Stout. There are few men in the city of New York who have won more fairly their proud positions in the mercantile world than he whose name stands at the top of this page. For more than 40 years he has carried on a large and increasing business with an energy, skill, and probity which could not fail of success. Andrew V. Stout was born in the city of New York, at No. 6 Canal Street, or, as it was then called, Pump Street, about the year 1814. When he was scarcely more than a child he was left fatherless, and thrown upon his own resources for a living. He was a manly little fellow, and, young as he was fully alive to the importance of the position he was compelled to assume. He was resolved not only to support himself, but also to acquire a good education, and by studying hard while most boys are at play, mastered the ordinary English branches by the time he was 12 years old. He had a mother and sister to support, and applied himself manfully to the task of accomplishing this. He was well grown for his age, and was generally supposed to be several years older than he really was. When he was 14 years old he applied for and received a position as assistant teacher of the English branches in one of the public schools of the city. The trustees of the school supposed he was at least 18 or 19 years old. Had his true age been known to them, it is probable he would not have received the appointment. He was not questioned upon the subject, and he was wise enough to keep his own counsel. He performed the duties of his position to the entire satisfaction of the school officials, and made such a good impression on his friends that at the age of 16 he was made assistant principal in one of the most important and popular private schools of the day, taught by Shepherd Johnson, a name well known to the old residents of New York. He was very young to fill this position, and, as may be supposed, it was peculiarly trying to one whose learning was mainly self-acquired. He was determined to succeed, however, and he applied himself energetically to master the course he was teaching. He studied harder and more constantly than any of his pupils, and was always fresh on the lessons for the day. When he was 16. Chapter 5. Years old he was so well grown and so mature that he passed for 20. Having succeeded so well in the management of his English classes, he was offered the position of instructor of Latin, with an increase of his salary. The offer at first dismayed him. He was thoroughly ignorant of the Latin language, and utterly unprepared for the duties demanded of him. He was very anxious to have the place, however, for he needed the increase of salary offered him, and, after hesitating a little while, accepted it. He purchased a Latin grammar, and engaged a private tutor. He studied hard, and soon mastered the rudiments of the language. In this way he managed to keep ahead of his classes. If a question was asked him which he could not answer, he postponed his reply, looked into the matter at night, and explained it the next morning. By such hard study and patient efforts did this boy, himself a mere novice, turn out what was admitted by all to be the best drilled Latin class Shepherd Johnson School had ever boasted of. When he was 18 years old he was made principal of Public School No. 2 of New York. He was living at Bushwick, where he resided with his mother and sister in a cozy little cottage, the garden of which was his pride, since he tended it with his own hands. It was his custom to rise every morning at 4 o'clock, and work in his garden until 7. Then he rode into the city, and attended to his school duties until 4 o'clock, when he returned home. He was now in possession of a comfortable living, but he was not satisfied to do this and nothing more. He was anxious to win fortune, to enter upon a more active and stirring pursuit, and he kept himself always on the watch for an opening. About the time he became the head of the public school we have referred to, he commenced to engage in various ventures of a commercial nature, devoting to them his evenings, and the hours of the day not demanded by his school. One of his relatives was a builder, with a fair trade, and had made some money by erecting houses in New York. Young Stout, who had saved a little money, proposed to him that they should take out a contract for building a number of dwellings on the then fashionable thoroughfare of East Broadway. The elder man was pleased with the plan, and at once consented to it. The houses were built at a handsome profit, others followed them, and by attending closely to this business, as well as his other duties, Andrew Stout, by the time he was 20 years old, had saved $17,000, a very large sum in those steady-going days. He was greatly aided by the custom of doing business on time, which then prevailed, but he never allowed one of his notes to be protested, and never asked for an extension. When he began business, he did so with the firm resolve that he would conduct his most insignificant transaction as a Christian man of honor. If he could not make money honestly, he would remain poor. Everybody saw the energy and judgment with which he conducted his affairs, and the strict integrity which marked them all, and he was not long in building up a reputation as a businessman of which any one might have been proud. The promptness and apparent ease with which he met every contract, and took up every note, caused it to be generally believed that he was a very rich man. Further than this, it was known that he was a zealous and earnest Christian, one who carried his religion into his business, and who lived up to his professions. He was an active member of the Methodist Church, and the businessman of the congregation to which he belonged. In his hands its finances prospered as they had never done before. Such was the reputation of this young man, who had not yet attained his majority. He held his position in the public school for several years after his appointment to it, but the requirements of his business at length compelled him to relinquish it. In the midst of his prosperity Mr. Stout made one mistake. A friend with whom he had been interested in building wished to procure some money from the bank, and Mr. Stout was induced, with considerable reluctance, to endorse his note for $5,000. One false step in business, as in other affairs of life, leads to another, and, in order to save this money, Mr. Stout was forced to renew his endorsements until his liabilities amounted to $23,000. To his dismay he was now informed by the builder for whose sake he had incurred this risk, that he, the builder, had failed, without making provision for the payment of the notes, and that Mr. Stout would have to account to the bank for them. Several methods of relief were open to Mr. Stout. He was worth $17,000, which he had earned by nights of toil, by economy, and by daily and earnest attention to business. To pay the notes would not only sweep away every penny that he had, but would leave him $6,000 in debt. He had never realized 1 cent from the money, and his name was used simply to accommodate the builder. Besides, he was not of age, though nobody suspected that fact, and he could repudiate his debts as a minor. He took no counsel, made no statement of his affairs to anyone, shut himself up in his own room, and considered thoughtfully what he should do, and then followed out the decision that he had reached. Having become bankrupt in money, he concluded he would not be so in character. He had earned $17,000 and could earn $17,000 more. He did confide in one friend. He went to a relative and asked him to lend him $6,000, the sum necessary to take up all the notes. The relative was astonished at the request and insisted upon knowing the facts in the case. Mr. Stout made a full and frank statement. It was met with the remark, "Well, Andrew, I thought you would be a rich man, but if this is the way you do your business, you will never be worth anything." But Mr. Stout did not want preaching, he wanted money, and as the relative seemed to hesitate about loaning the money, as no security was offered, Mr. Stout curtly told him he could do as he pleased about it, he could get the money somewhere, and pay the notes. The money was promised, and he went on his way. The bank watched the young financier with a great deal of interest. The whole matter had been discussed often in the bank, and the wonder was how young Stout would meet the blow. It was supposed that he would ask for an extension, and it was agreed to give it to him, and to make the time of payment convenient to his ability. Had he proposed to compromise the matter by paying one half, the bank would have accepted it. That would have left him a capital of nearly $8,000 for a fresh start. Had he offered his $17,000 on condition that he was released from all liability, the notes would have been cancelled with alacrity. He did neither. He proposed no compromise, asked no extension, and attempted to negotiate no settlement. When the first note became due, he paid it. He did the same with the second and third. After the third payment, he was called into the office of the president. Reference was made to the notes, and to the fact that he had obtained no benefit from the money. The president told him the bank was ready to renew the notes, and to give him any accommodation that he might ask. Mr. Stout simply replied that the blow was a heavy one, but that having assumed the obligation, he should discharge it, that he asked no favors, and as the notes matured he should take them up. He paid every dollar due, and every one was certain that his wealth must be very large. His manliness, pluck, and integrity, which carried him through that crisis, became the sure foundation stone on which his great fortune was laid. He took the front rank among successful financiers, and his honorable course in that crisis established his fame as an honest man, in whom it would be safe to confide. Years of earnest and active business life have not changed that character, nor allowed a blot or stain to cloud that reputation. Some years later, Mr. Stout became a merchant. He established a wholesale boot and shoe store, and engaged actively in that business. He brought to his new calling the energy, prudence, and integrity which had distinguished him all through his life, and was successful from the first. He worked hard. His business hours were from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. During his busy season, for months in the year, he worked until 10, and often until 12, paying his employees extra wages for labor performed after the regular business hours. Sometimes he worked until 4 in the morning, but that did not deter him from being in the store at the usual hour for opening. He was always the last to go home, never leaving the store until the business of the day was over and the house was closed. He extended his operations into dry goods, meeting with equal success in this department. As his business expanded, he was compelled to form various partnerships, but in all these arrangements he reserved to himself, like Stuart, the exclusive management of the finances. About 18 years ago, the shoe and leather merchants of the city decided to organize a bank, in which their interest should be the principal consideration. Mr. Stout engaged in the effort with great enthusiasm, and the Shoe and Leather Bank of New York was at length organized under the most auspicious circumstances. Mr. Stout was the largest stockholder in the new bank, and was elected one of its directors. His influence was potent in directing its first operations, and the next year he was elected vice president, in which position he really had the control of the enterprise left to him. A year later he was elected president of the bank, a position which he still holds, being in point of service the oldest bank president in New York. Upon questions of banking and finance, his views are listened to with great respect by his associates, who have proof of their soundness in the splendid success of the institution over which he presides, and it may be truly said that there are few men in the city who enjoy so large a share of the public confidence as is bestowed upon him. As a citizen, he is public-spirited and liberal. Some years ago, he held the office of City Chamberlain, and during his administration of it a difficulty arose in regard to paying the police force their wages. Knowing that the men and their families would suffer if the money were not promptly paid them, Mr. Stout generously advanced the necessary sum from his private means, looking to the city to reimburse him. In grateful acknowledgment of this practical sympathy for them, the force presented him with a handsome testimonial. His fortune is immense, and is used liberally in behalf of the cause of the Christian religion. His charities are said to be large, but one rarely hears of them, so quietly are they done. He is married and has a family. No man's career holds out more encouragement to young men seeking to rise than that of Andrew V. Stout. It shows that courage, patient industry, and business capacity will bring fortune to any honest worker. His uniform success speaks volumes in favor of a young man striving to lead a Christian life in the midst of his business cares and struggles. God's blessing follows such an one at every step, and he will succeed in the end, whatever trials may beset his path at first. It is a great mistake to suppose that a man's success depends on his sharpness. Shrewdness is a valuable quality, but it must be coupled with a plain, practical honesty, or it will amount to nothing in the end. A man must be faithful to his God if he would have his work stand. Chapter 6. Jonas Chickering. On Tremorne Street, in the city of Boston, near the Roxbury line, there stands an immense building of brick, said to be larger than any edifice in the United States, save the Capitol at Washington. It is built in the form of a hollow square, with a large courtyard in the center, and the building and courtyard together cover an area of 5 acres. It is 5 stories in height on the outer side, and 6 on the inner, the courtyard being 1 story lower than the street. The building is 262 feet in length from east to west, and 245 from north to south, the shorter distance being the length on Tremorne Street. The width of the building all around the courtyard is 50 feet. It contains 900 windows, with 11,000 panes of glass, and when lighted up at night seems almost a solid mass of fire. From 500 to 600 men are employed here in various capacities, and an immense steam engine of 120 horsepower furnishes the motive power for the machinery. Altogether, it is one of the most prominent and interesting of all the sights of Boston, and the visitor is surprised to learn that it is due entirely to the energy and genius of one who, but 34 years previous to its erection, came to Boston a penniless stranger. The building is the famous pianoforte manufactory of Chickering and Sons, and its founder was Jonas Chickering, the subject of this sketch. Jonas Chickering was born at New Ipswich, New Hampshire, on the 5th of April, 1798. His father was a blacksmith by trade, and employed his leisure time in cultivating a small farm of which he was the owner. He was esteemed by his neighbors as an upright, reliable man, and prudent and careful in his temporal affairs. The family being poor, young Jonas was required to do his share toward cultivating the farm, and received only such education as was afforded by the district schools in the vicinity. He was noted at an early age for his passionate love of music. When a mere child, he learned to play on the fife, and was such a proficient performer that he was called upon with the town drummer to furnish music for the militia musters, which were then the pride of the town. These were happy days for the lad, but his pleasure was marred by the ridicule which the contrast between his slender figure and the stalwart frame of the 6-foot drummer caused the fun-loving townspeople to indulge in. Soon after this he learned to play on the clarionet, and when only 17 or 18 years old, was so advanced in his art that he could read at sight music of the most difficult character. At the age of 17 he was apprenticed to a cabinet maker to learn his trade, and remained with him for 3 years, exerting himself to become thorough master of every detail of the business. Toward the close of his apprenticeship, an event occurred which changed the whole current of his life, and placed him in what proved to him the road to fame and fortune. One of the wealthiest citizens of New Ipswich was the fortunate owner of a piano, the only instrument of the kind in the place, but his treasure was almost useless to him, for the reason that it was out of tune, and seriously damaged in some respects. It had lain in this condition for a long time, no one in or near the place being able to make the necessary repairs. In this extremity the owner bethought him of Jonas Chickering, who had acquired an enviable reputation for skill in his trade, and it was thought that a good cabinet maker ought of necessity to be a clever piano maker. Young Chickering, thus appealed to, consented to undertake the task, as much for the purpose of becoming familiar with the instrument as of earning the sum the owner of it proposed to pay for the repairs. He had not the slightest knowledge of its internal organization, but he believed that by patient investigation he could master it, and he knew that the correctness of his ear would enable him to tune it. He made a careful study of the instrument and of every separate part, spent days over the task, discovered the injury and the cause of it, and not only took the instrument to pieces and restored it to its former condition, but did his work so well that the piano was pronounced fully as good in every respect as when it was new. This was not all. He discovered defects in the instrument which even its maker was not able to remedy, and his fertile brain at once suggested to him a plan for removing them. Here was a chance for him, and he resolved to profit by it. He would abandon cabinet making and learn the manufacture of pianos. Then, when master of his trade, he would make use of his discoveries, and earn both fame and fortune. When his determination to change his business was made known, his friends attributed it to his desire to be in the midst of musical instruments, and where he could gratify his love of music, but this was only a part of the motive which influenced him. He meant to rise in the world, and he was sure that he held in his hands the means of doing so. In 1818, when 20 years old, he removed to Boston, and obtained employment with a cabinet maker. He did this in order to give him time to look about him, to become familiar with the city and city life, and to acquire such other information as would enable him to decide upon the best means of putting his plans into execution. He saved his wages with the greatest care, and at the end of his first year in Boston had accumulated a modest little sum, which he meant should support him while he was learning his new trade. On the 15th of February, 1819, without the loss of a day, he began work with a piano maker. He had now entered upon what he meant should be the business of his life, and he was resolved that he would be master of it. From the first he took rank in his employer's factory as the most careful workman in it. He spared no pains to make his knowledge full in every detail. Time was of no consequence compared with knowledge, and he was never anxious to hurry through with his work. It soon came to be recognized by his employer and fellow workmen that he was the best fitted for those portions of the work upon the instrument which required the greatest patience as well as the greatest care, and the most difficult and delicate work was always entrusted to him, his wages being, of course, in proportion. Other men had no thought but to earn a living. This man meant to win fame and fortune, and to enlarge the scope of that art to which he was so passionately devoted. He labored with his mind as well as his hands, familiarizing himself with every detail of the manufacture, and devising in silence the means for improving the instrument and the implements used in its construction. He could afford to wait, to be slower than his fellows. Every moment spent over his task made his workmanship the better, and opened to his mind new sources of improvement. He spent 3 years as a journeyman, and then went into business for himself. He associated himself with a Mr. Stewart, under the firm of Stewart and Chickering. 50 years ago the pianoforte was a wretched piece of mechanism compared with the superb instrument of today. It was originally a progressive growth from the ancient lyre, through the harp, psaltery, dulcimer, clavictherium, clavichord, virginal, spinet, harpsichord, to the piano of Cristofori in the early years of the last century. At the period of Mr. Chickering's entrance into business, it was still very imperfect, and the various manufacturers of the instrument were earnestly endeavoring to discover some means of remedying the defects of which they were all conscious. There are 4 divisions in the manufacture of a piano, each of which requires great skill and care. These are, first, the making of the framing and the soundboard; second, the stringing, third, the keys and action, fourth, the case and ornamental work. The framing requires strength and simplicity. It is this portion of the instrument which sustains the tension of the strings, which in full to large-sized pianos is not less than from 6 to 12 tons, and it is a matter of prime necessity that the portions which serve as a strut or stretcher between the ends of the strings, and which are to resist this enormous pull, must be made correspondingly strong and rigid, since by any gradual yielding under the pull of the strings, their lengths and tensions, and hence their tone, must undergo proportionate change. In the old pianos, the frames were of wood, and it was impossible to use any but small, short strings, for the reason given above. Fullness and power were not to be thought of, and builders were obliged to confine themselves to securing truthfulness of tone. A multitude of causes, among which were the changes in the weather, combined to render it impossible to keep the old-fashioned instrument in tune. It was this defect which first attracted the attention of Jonas Chickering, and his first endeavor was to produce an instrument which would withstand the climatic changes which were so troublesome to the old ones. He was fully aware of the fact that the piano trade in this country was then so unimportant that it offered but little inducement to a man who could manufacture only the old instrument, but he believed that by producing an instrument of better proportions, and one fuller, richer, and more lasting in tone, he could create a demand for it which would ensure the sale of all he could manufacture. His hope of success lay not in the old, but in an improved and nobler instrument. That he was correct in his belief, the magnificent instrument of today which bears his name, and the lucrative business he has left to his sons, amply demonstrate. Others besides himself were working for the same end, and he knew that he would have to bear the test of determined and intelligent competition. He applied himself to his purpose with enthusiasm. He carefully studied the theory of atmospheric vibration and musical combination, as well as an application of the principles of mechanical philosophy to the construction of the instrument. He went deep into the science involved in his work, into the philosophy of melody. Passionately devoted to music, he was ambitious of placing that which has been so truly called the king of instruments within the reach of all lovers of harmony, and to give them the best instrument that human invention could produce, an instrument which should not only withstand atmospheric changes, but which should yield the richest, fullest volume of melody, with the least exertion to the performer. His progress was slow, but it was sure. Beginning with an improvement in the action, he accomplished, in a great measure, in 1838, his plan for preserving the permanence and purity of the tone of the instrument by casting the entire iron framing with the parallel bars in one piece. Iron had for some time before this been in general use for framing, but the frame was cast in a few separate parts, which were put together by means of bolts and screws, a plan which is still used to a considerable extent in Europe. By his plan of casting the frame and its supporting bars in one solid piece, Mr. Chickering not only prevented the frame from yielding to the pull of the strings, thus securing permanence and purity of tone, but was enabled to use larger frames and more strings, which greatly increased the capacity of the instrument. Several other improvements were made by him, the most important of which was the invention, in 1845, of the circular scale for square pianos, which is now in general use in this country and in Europe. This consists in giving to the row of tuning pins and rest planks previously straight in these instruments a curved disposition, answering nearly to an arc of a circle, the advantage being that the strings become less crowded, larger hammers, and a more direct blow can be secured, and the tone is both strengthened and improved. With a rare generosity, Mr. Chickering declined to patent this improvement, which would have enabled him to drive competition out of the market. He regarded it as so necessary to a good piano that he declared that all makers ought to have the use of it, as it would thus be within the power of all persons able to purchase a piano to avail themselves of it, whether they bought a Chickering or not. Such generosity is too rare to fail to receive the praise it merits. Mr. Chickering did not continue long in business with Mr. Stewart. The latter withdrew in a few years, and Mr. Chickering carried on the business alone. In 1830 he formed a partnership with Captain John Mackay, a retired ship merchant. In the new firm Captain Mackay took charge of the finances and the office business, while Mr. Chickering devoted himself entirely to the mechanical department. The operations of the new house were very successful. The improvements made by Mr. Chickering from the first created a demand for their instruments which was sometimes so great that it was difficult to supply it. This demand continued to increase until the house was perfectly easy as to money matters, and able to enlarge its facilities very greatly. It was Mr. Chickering's design that each separate instrument should be an improvement upon those which had preceded it, and he was careful that this plan should not miscarry. In a few years the firm was enabled to import the foreign materials needed by the cargo, thus saving the profit which they had hitherto been compelled to pay the importer. Besides this saving, they were enabled to keep on hand a large stock of the woods used in the instrument, and thus it was allowed to become more thoroughly seasoned than that which they had been compelled to purchase, from time to time, in small quantities. In 1841, Captain Mackay sailed from Boston for South America for the purpose of obtaining a supply of the woods needed by the firm, but he never returned, and as no tidings of him or his ship were ever received, it is supposed that the vessel went down at sea with all on board. Mr. Chickering now decided to continue the business without a partner. His friends supposed that in assuming the management of the concern, in addition to the direction of the mechanical department, and the constant mental labor to which he subjected himself in his efforts to improve the piano, he was undertaking more than he was capable of performing. They feared his health would break down under it. Besides, it was generally believed that, in spite of Mr. Chickering's undoubted skill in his own department, he was not much of a businessman. He was confident of his own ability, however, and did not hesitate to assume the new responsibility. The business of which he now became the owner was very heavy and extensive. Soon after the beginning of his connection with Captain Mackay, the firm erected a large factory for the purpose of carrying on their business. 100 hands were employed in it when opened, but in a few years it was necessary to employ more than twice that number, so rapidly did the business increase. The supply of materials needed was ample and of the very best quality, for Mr. Chickering never allowed an inferior article to be used. The warerooms were large and handsomely fitted up, and were filled with instruments ranging in chapter. He did not live to see it completed, however. He died at the house of a friend from the rupture of a blood vessel, produced, it is believed, by severe mental labor, on the 8th of December, 1853. His fortune at the time of his death was estimated at $250,000. His sons assumed the charge of the business, which they still conduct. The loss of Mr. Chickering was felt by all classes of his fellow citizens, especially by the poor. To them he had been a kind and generous friend. Distress never appealed to him in vain, and he proved a faithful steward of the riches committed to his care. Yet he performed his charities with such a modesty and reticence that few beside the grateful recipients were aware of them. Indeed, it was his custom to enjoin secrecy upon those whom he assisted, but they would not remain quiet. Chapter 6. His liberality is in striking contrast with the closeness of many who were worth more than 20 times his wealth, but who lacked his warm and sympathizing nature. Chapter 7. Nicholas Longworth. The grape culture of the United States is yet in its infancy. Although the annual wine product is estimated at nearly 3 millions of gallons, there can be no doubt that ere many years shall have elapsed America will rank as one of the most important wine countries of the world. California is already extending her vineyards for miles along her smiling valleys, where the clear sky and the balmy air, which are unchangeable at the season of the grape harvest, permit a degree of perfection in the fruit unattainable in any European country. Already her wines are commanding an enviable place in the markets of the world, with no apparent limits to the growing demand for them. The hillsides of the lower Ohio Valley are lined with thriving vineyards, whose rich clusters of Catawba and Isabella grapes delight the eye on every hand, and thousands of acres are now given to successful grape culture, where formerly only a few straggling vines were seen. more than 500,000 gallons of wine are now annually produced in the neighborhood of Cincinnati alone, and find a market in that city, and what was but a few years ago a mere experiment is now one of the chief sources of the wonderful prosperity of the Ohio Valley, and one of the most important features in the commerce of the Queen City of the West. The success which has attended this branch of our industry must be a matter of congratulation to the whole country, and the man to whose courage, energy, and liberality it is mainly due must be regarded as a public benefactor. This man, Nicholas Longworth by name, was born at Newark, New Jersey, on the 16th of January, 1782. His father had been a man of large property, but in consequence of being a Tory during the Revolution, his possessions were confiscated, and he and his family impoverished. Young Nicholas's childhood was passed in indigence, and it is said that he was apprenticed to a shoemaker, when a mere lad, to learn the trade as a means of livelihood. However this may be, it is certain that when very young he went to South Carolina as a clerk for his elder brother. The climate of the South, however, did not suit his health, and he returned to Newark, and began the study of the law. He was poor, and the East was overcrowded, even at that early day, and offered but few inducements to a young man entirely dependent upon his own efforts. Ohio was then the Far West, and emigration was setting in toward it rapidly. Those who had seen the country related what then seemed marvelous tales of its wonderful fertility and progress. Few professional men were seeking the distant land, and Longworth felt convinced that the services of such as did go would assuredly be in demand, and he resolved to cast his lot with the West. In 1803, at the age of 21, he removed to the little village of Cincinnati, and, having fixed upon this place as his future home, entered the law office of Judge Jacob Burnett, long the ablest jurist in Ohio. He soon won the confidence and esteem of his instructor, and succeeded so well in his studies that in an unusually short time he was admitted to the bar. He entered upon the practice of his profession with energy, and soon acquired a profitable business, which increased rapidly. He was a man of simple habits, and lived economically. His savings were considerable, and were regularly invested by him in real estate in the suburbs of the town. Land was cheap at that time, some of his lots costing him but $10 each. Long before his death they were worth more than as many thousands. He had a firm conviction that Cincinnati was destined to become one of the largest and most flourishing cities in the Union, and that his real estate would increase in value at a rate which would render him wealthy in a very few years. His first client was a man accused of horse stealing, in those days the most heinous offense known to Western law. Longworth secured his acquittal, but the fellow had no money to pay his counsel, and in the absence of funds gave Longworth 2 second-hand copper stills, which were his property. These the lawyer accepted, thinking that he could easily dispose of them for cash, as they were rare and valuable there in those days. They were in the keeping of Mr. Joel Williams, who carried on a tavern adjacent to the river, and who was afterward one of the largest property holders in Cincinnati. Mr. Williams was building a distillery at the time, and, as he had confidently reckoned upon using the 2 stills in his possession, was considerably nonplussed when Longworth presented his order for them. In his extremity he offered to purchase them from the lawyer for a lot of 33 acres of barren land in the town, which was then worth little or nothing. Longworth hesitated, for although he had an almost prophetic belief in the future value of the land, he was sorely in need of ready money, but at length he accepted the offer. The deed for the land was made out in his name, and the stills became the property of Mr. Williams. The distillery was built, and its owner realized a fortune, but Longworth did more. His 33 acres of barren land were soon in the very heart of Cincinnati, and long before his death were valued at $2 millions. The foresight of Mr. Longworth was fully justified by the course of events. The growth of Cincinnati was almost marvelous in its rapidity. In 1802, it contained about 800 inhabitants, in 1810, 2,540, in 1820, 9,060, in 1830, 24,831, in 1840, 46,338, in 1850, 118,761, and in 1860, just 3 years before Mr. Longworth's death, 171,293 inhabitants. The reader can easily imagine the immense profits which a half-century's increase placed in the hands of the far-seeing lawyer. It seems almost like reading some old fairy tale to peruse the accounts of successful ventures in real estate in American cities. They have sprung up as if by magic, and it is impossible to say where their development will end. Said a gentleman of less than 35 years of age to the writer of these pages, "I am the oldest native-born citizen of Chicago. When I first saw the light, my native place could not boast even the dignity of a village, and young as I am, I have witnessed all this wonderful growth." The prosperity of Cincinnati was scarcely less marked, as the career of Mr. Longworth shows. The investment of a comparatively insignificant sum laid the foundation of his fortune, and the first counsel fee he ever earned, a sum trifling in itself, placed him in possession of millions. Mr. Longworth continued carefully to invest his gains in real estate. The Chapter 8. George Peabody. It is not often that men who pass their lives in the acquisition of money are able to retain the desire to give it to others who have had no share in the earning of it. In European countries, the wealthy merchant commonly uses his fortune for the purpose of founding a family, and securing sometimes a title of nobility. His wealth is entailed, that it may remain in his family and benefit remote generations, but few save those of his own blood enjoy any benefit from it, and the world is no better off for his life and success than if he had never been born. In America, instances of personal generosity and benevolence on a large scale are of more common occurrence than in the Old World. We have already borne witness to the munificence of Girard, Astor, Lawrence, Longworth, and Stewart, and shall yet present to the reader other instances of this kind in the remaining pages of this work. We have now to trace the career of one who far exceeded any of these in the extent and magnitude of his liberality, and who, while neglecting none connected with him by ties of blood, took the whole English-speaking race for his family, and by scattering his blessings far and wide on both sides of the Atlantic, has won a proud name as one who loved his fellow men. George Peabody came of an old English family, which traced its descent back to the year of our Lord 61, the days of the heroic Boadicea, down through the brilliant circle of the Knights of the Round Table, to Francis Peabody, who in 1635 went from St. Albans, in Hertfordshire, to the New World, and settled in Danvers, Massachusetts, where the subject of this memoir was born 160 years later, on the 18th of February, 1795. The parents of George Peabody were poor, and hard work was the lot to which he was born, a lot necessary to develop his sterling qualities of mind and heart. He was possessed of a strong, vigorous constitution, and a quick, penetrating intellect. His education was limited, for he was taken from school at the age of 11, and set to earning his living. Upon leaving school, he was apprenticed to a Mr. Sylvester Proctor, who kept a country store in Danvers. Here he worked hard and faithfully for 4 or 5 years, devoting himself, with an energy and determination surprising in one so young, to learn the first principles of business. His mind matured more rapidly than his body, and he was a man in intellect long before he was out of his teens. Having gained all the information it was possible to acquire in so small an establishment, he began to wish for a wider field for the exercise of his abilities. A retail grocery store was no longer the place for one possessed of such talents, and thoroughly conscious of them at such an early age, and it was natural that he should desire some more important and responsible position. Accordingly, he left Mr. Proctor's employment, and spent a year with his maternal grandfather at Post Mills Village, Thetford, Vermont. George Peabody's year at Post Mills, says a writer who knew him, must have been a year of intense quiet, with good examples always before him, and good advice whenever occasion called for it, for Mr. Dodge and his wife were both too shrewd to bore him with it needlessly. It was on his return from this visit that he spent a night at a tavern in Concord, NH, and paid for his entertainment by soaring wood the next morning. That, however, must have been a piece of George's own voluntary economy, for Jeremiah Dodge would never have sent his grandson home to Danvers without the means of procuring the necessaries of life on the way, and still less, if possible, would Mrs. Dodge. The interest with which Mr. Peabody remembered this visit to Post Mills is shown by his second visit so late in life, and his gift of a library as large a library as that place needs. Of its influence on his subsequent career, of course, there is no record. Perhaps it was not much, /1, at least, it gave him a good chance for quiet thinking, at an age when he needed it, and the labors of the farm may have been useful both to mind and body. At the age of 16, in the year 1811, he went to Newburyport, and became a clerk in the store of his elder brother, David Peabody, who was engaged in the dry goods business at that place. He exhibited unusual capacity and promise in his calling, and soon drew upon himself the favorable attention of the merchants of the place. He was prompt, reliable, and energetic, and from the first established an enviable reputation for personal and professional integrity. It is said that he earned here the first money he ever made outside of his business. This was by writing ballots for the Federal party in Newburyport. Printed ballots had not then come into use. He did not stay long in Newburyport, as a great fire, which burned up a considerable part of the town, destroyed his brother's store, and obliged him to seek employment elsewhere. He always retained a warm attachment to the place, however, an attachment which a resident of the town explains as follows. The cause of Mr. George Peabody's interest in Newburyport was not alone that he had lived here for a brief period, or that his relatives had lived here, but rather it was the warm friendship that had been shown him, which was, in fact, the basis of his subsequent prosperity. He left here in 1811, and returned in 1857. The 46 intervening years had borne to the grave most of the persons with whom he had formed acquaintance. Among those he recognized were several who were in business, or clerks, on State Street in 1811, Messrs. John Porter, Moses Kimball, Prescott Spaulding, and a few others. Mr. Spaulding was 14 years older than Mr. Peabody, and in business when the latter was a clerk with his uncle, Colonel John Peabody. Mr. Peabody was here in 1857, on the day of the agricultural fair, and was walking in the procession with the late Mayor Davenport, when he saw Mr. Spaulding on the sidewalk, and at once left the procession to greet him. Mr. Spaulding had rendered him the greatest of services. When Mr. Peabody left Newburyport, he was under age, and not worth $1. Mr. Spaulding gave him letters of credit in Boston, through which he obtained $2,000 worth of merchandise of Mr. James Reed, who was so favorably impressed with his appearance, that he subsequently gave him credit for a larger amount. This was his start in life, as he afterward acknowledged, for at a public entertainment in Boston, when his credit was good for any amount, and in any part of the world, Mr. Peabody laid his hand on Mr. Reed's shoulder, and said to those present, "My friends, here is my first patron, and he is the man who sold me my first bill of goods." After he was established in Georgetown, D.C., the first consignment made to him was by the late Francis Todd, of Newburyport. It was from these facts that Newburyport was always pleasant in his memory, and the donation he made to the public library was on his own suggestion, that he desired to do something of a public nature for our town. From New England, George Peabody turned his face southward, and entered the employment of his uncle, Mr. John Peabody, who was engaged in the dry goods business in Georgetown, in the District of Columbia. He reached that place in the spring of 1812, but as the Second War with England broke out about the same time, was not able to give his immediate attention to business. He became a member of a volunteer company of artillery, which was stationed at Fort Warburton, but as no active duty was required of the company, he soon went back to his uncle's store. His uncle was a poor man and a bad manager, and for 2 years the business was conducted by George Peabody, and in his own name, but at the end of that time, seeing the business threatened with ruin by his uncle's incapacity, he resigned his situation, and entered the service of Mr. Elisha Riggs, who had just established a wholesale dry goods house in Georgetown. Mr. Riggs furnished the capital for the concern, and Mr. Peabody was given the management of it. Soon after this, the latter became a partner in the house. It is said that when Mr. Riggs invited Mr. Peabody to become his partner, the latter informed him that he could not legally assume the responsibilities of the business, as he was only 19 years old. This was no objection in the mind of the merchant, as he wanted a young and active assistant, and had discerned in his boy manager the qualities which never fail to win success. The new business in which he was engaged consisted chiefly in the importation and sale of European goods, and consignments of dry goods from the northern cities. It extended over a wide field, and gave Mr. Peabody a fine opportunity for the display of his abilities. Mr. Riggs' friends blamed him very much for leaving his business so entirely in the hands of a boy of 19, but he had better proof than they that his affairs were not only in good but in the best hands, and he answered them all by telling them that time would justify his course. Mr. Peabody travelled extensively in establishing his business, often journeying into the wild and unsettled regions of the border states on horseback. He worked with energy and intelligence, and in 1815 the business was found to be so extensive that a removal to Baltimore became necessary. About this time a sort of irregular banking business was added to the operations of the house. This was chiefly the suggestion of Mr. Peabody, and proved a source of great profit. Mr. Peabody quickly took a prominent rank among the merchants of Baltimore. His manner was frank and engaging, and won him many friends. He was noted for a judgment quick and cautious, clear and sound, a decided purpose, a firm will, energetic and persevering industry, punctuality and fidelity in every engagement, justice and honor controlling every transaction, and courtesy, that true courtesy which springs from genuine kindness, presiding over the intercourse of life. His business continued to increase, and in 1822 it became necessary to establish branches in Philadelphia and New York, over which Mr. Peabody exercised a careful supervision. He was thoroughly familiar with every detail of his business, and never suffered his vigilance to relax, however competent might be the subordinates in the immediate charge of those details. In 1827 he went to England on business for his firm, and during the next 10 years made frequent voyages between New York and London. In 1829 Mr. Riggs withdrew from the firm, and Mr. Peabody became the actual head of the house, the style of the firm, which had previously been Riggs and Peabody, being changed to Peabody, Riggs and Company. The firm had for some time been the financial agents of the state of Maryland, and had managed the negotiations confided to them with great skill and success, and every year their banking department became more important and more profitable. In 1836 Mr. Peabody determined to extend his business, which was already very large, to England, and to open a branch house in London. In 1837 he removed to that city for the purpose of taking charge of his house there, and from that time London became his home. The summer of this year was marked by one of the most terrible commercial crises the United States has ever known. A large number of the banks suspended specie payment, and the majority of the mercantile houses were either ruined or in the greatest distress. Thousands of merchants, until then prosperous, were hopelessly ruined. That great sympathetic nerve of the commercial world, credit, said Edward Everett, as far as the United States was concerned, was for the time paralyzed. At that moment Mr. Peabody not only stood firm himself, but was the cause of firmness in others. There were not at that time, probably, half a dozen other men in Europe who, upon the subject of American securities, would have been listened to for a moment in the parlor of the Bank of England. But his judgment commanded respect, his integrity won back the reliance which men had been accustomed to place in American securities. The reproach in which they were all involved was gradually wiped away from those of a substantial character, and if, on this solid basis of unsuspected good faith, he reared his own prosperity, let it be remembered that at the same time he retrieved the credit of the state of Maryland, of which he was agent, performing that miracle by which the word of an honest man turns paper into gold. The conduct of Mr. Peabody, as well as the evidences which he gave of his remarkable capacity for business, in this crisis, placed him among the foremost merchants of London. He carried on his business upon a large scale from his base of operations in that city. He bought British manufactures in all parts of England and shipped them to the United States. His vessels brought back in return all kinds of American produce which would command a ready sale in England. Profitable as these ventures were, there was another branch of his business much more remunerative to him. The merchants and manufacturers on both sides of the Atlantic who consigned their goods to him frequently procured from him advances upon the goods long before they were sold. At other times they would leave large sums in his hands long after the goods were disposed of, knowing that they could draw whenever they needed, and that in the meanwhile their money was being so profitably invested that they were certain of a proper interest for their loans. Thus Mr. Peabody gradually became a banker, in which pursuit he was as successful as he had been as a merchant. In 1843 he withdrew from the house of Peabody, Riggs and Company, and established the house of George Peabody and Company, of Warneford Court, City. His dealings were chiefly with America, and in American securities, and he was always regarded as one of the best specimens of the American merchant ever seen in London. He was very proud of his country, and though he passed so many years of his life abroad, he never forgot that he was an American. In speaking of the manner in which he organized his business establishment, he once said, "I have endeavored, in the constitution of its members, and the character of its business, to make it an American house, and to give it an American atmosphere, to furnish it with American journals, to make it a center of American news, and an agreeable place for my American friends visiting London." It was his custom, from his first settlement in England, to celebrate the anniversary of the independence of his country by an entertainment at one of the public houses in the city, to which the most distinguished Americans in London were always invited, as were also many of the prominent men of Great Britain. And this dinner was only discontinued in deference to the general celebration of the day which was afterward instituted by the whole body of Americans resident in the British metropolis. In the year 1851, when it was thought that there would be no representation of the achievements of American skill and industry in the great exhibition of that year, from a lack of funds, Mr. Peabody generously supplied the sum of $15,000, which enabled the commissioners to make a suitable display of the American contributions. Said the Honorable Edward Everett, alluding to this act, "In most, perhaps in all other countries, this exhibition had been a government affair. Commissioners were appointed by authority to protect the interests of the exhibitors, and, what was more important, appropriations of money had been made to defray their expenses. No appropriations were made by Congress. Our exhibitors arrived friendless, some of them penniless, in the great commercial Babel of the world. They found the portion of the Crystal Palace assigned to our country unprepared for the specimens of art and industry which they had brought with them, naked and unadorned by the side of the neighboring arcades and galleries fitted up with elegance and splendor by the richest governments in Europe." The English press began to launch its too ready sarcasms at the sorry appearance which Brother Jonathan seemed likely to make, and all the exhibitors from this country, as well as those who felt an interest in their success, were disheartened. At this critical moment, our friend stepped forward. He did what Congress should have done. By liberal advances on his part, the American department was fitted up, and day after day, as some new product of American ingenuity and taste was added to the list. McCormick's Reaper, Colt's revolver, Powers's Greek slave, Hobbes's unpickable lock, Hoe's wonderful printing presses, and Bond's more wonderful spring governor. It began to be suspected that Brother Jonathan was not quite so much of a simpleton as had been thought. He had contributed his full share, if not to the splendor, at least to the utilities of the exhibition. In fact, the leading journal at London, with a magnanimity which did it honor, admitted that England had derived more real benefit from the contributions of the United States than from those of any other country. As has been said, Mr. Peabody made the bulk of his colossal fortune in the banking business. He had a firm faith in American securities, and dealt in them largely, and with confidence. His business instinct was remarkable, his judgment in mercantile and financial matters almost infallible, and he made few mistakes. His course was now onward and upward, and each year marked an increase of his wealth. His business operations were conducted in pursuance of a rigid system which was never relaxed. To the very close of his life he never abandoned the exact or businesslike manner in which he sought to make money. He gave away millions with a generosity never excelled, yet he could be exacting to a penny in the fulfillment of a contract. In his youth he contracted habits of economy, and these he retained to the last. Being unmarried, he did not subject himself to the expense of a complete domestic establishment, but lived in chambers, and entertained his friends at his club or at a coffee house. His habits were simple in every respect, and he was often seen making his dinner on a mutton chop at a table laden, at his cost, with the most sumptuous and tempting viands. His personal expenses for 10 years did not average $3,000 per annum. The conductor on an English railway once overcharged him $1 for fare. He promptly complained to the directors, and had the man discharged. "Not," said he, "that I could not afford to pay the $1, but the man was cheating many travellers to whom the swindle would be offensive." Several years ago he chanced to ride in a hack in Salem, Massachusetts, and upon reaching his destination tendered the driver his usual fee of 50 cents. "Here's your change, sir," said the man, handing him back 15 cents. "Change!" exclaimed Mr. Peabody. "Why, I'm not entitled to any." "Yes, you are. I don't charge but 35 cents for a ride in my hack." "How do you live, then?" "By fair dealing, sir. I don't believe in making a man pay more than a thing is worth just because I have an opportunity." Mr. Peabody was so much pleased with this reply, that as long as he remained in Salem he sought this man out and gave him his custom. In his dress Mr. Peabody was simple and unostentatious. He was scrupulously neat and tasteful, but there was nothing about him to indicate his vast wealth. He seldom wore any jewelry, using merely a black band for his watch guard. Display of all kinds he abominated. He made several visits to his native country during his last residence in London, and commemorated each one of them by acts of princely munificence. He gave large sums to the cause of education, and to religious and charitable objects, and made each one of his near kindred wealthy. None of his relatives received less than $100,000, and some were given as much as 3 times that sum. He gave immense sums to the poor of London, and became their benefactor to such an extent that Queen Victoria sent him her portrait, which she had caused to be executed for him at a cost of over $40,000, in token of her appreciation of his services in behalf of the poor of her realm. Mr. Peabody made another visit to the United States in 1866, and upon this occasion added large sums to many of the donations he had already made in this country. He remained here until May, 1867, when he returned to England. He came back in June, 1869, but soon sailed again for England. His health had become very feeble, and it was his belief that it would be better in the atmosphere of London, to which he had been so long accustomed. His hope of recovery was vain. He failed to rally upon reaching London, and died in that city on the 4th of November, 1869. The news of his death created a profound sadness on both sides of the Atlantic, for his native and his adopted country alike revered him as a benefactor. The Queen caused his body to be placed in a vault in Westminster Abbey, amidst the greatest and noblest of her kingdom, until all was in readiness for its transportation to the United States in a royal man-of-war. The Congress of the United States authorized the President to make such arrangements for the reception of the body as he should deem necessary. Sovereigns, statesmen, and warriors united to do homage to the mortal remains of this plain, simple man, who, beginning life a poor boy, and never departing from the character of an unassuming citizen. Chapter 7. Had made humanity his debtor by his generosity and goodness. He was born across the ocean with kingly honors, 2 great nations acting as chief mourners, and then, when the pomp and the splendor of the occasion were ended, they laid him down in his native earth by the side of the mother from whom he had imbibed those principles of integrity and goodness which were the foundation of his fame and fortune. It is impossible to obtain an accurate statement of the donations made by Mr. Peabody to the objects which enlisted his sympathy. In addition to those mentioned in the list below, he gave away for various public purposes sums ranging from $250 to $1,000, and extending back as far as the year 1835. He divided among his relatives the sum of about $3 millions, giving them a portion during his last visit to this country, and leaving them the remainder at his death. The following is a statement of his more important donations during his life, including the bequests contained in his last will and testament. To the state of Maryland, for negotiating the loan of $8 million. $60,000 to the Peabody Institute, Baltimore, MD, including accrued interest. $1,500,000 to the Southern Education Fund. $3 million to Yale College. $150,000 to Harvard College. $150,000 to Peabody Academy, Massachusetts. $140,000 to Phillips Academy, Massachusetts. $25,000 to Peabody Institute, etc., at Peabody, Mass. $250,000 to Kenyon College, Ohio. $25,000 to Memorial Church in Georgetown, Mass. $100,000 to Homes for the Poor in London. $3 million to libraries in Georgetown, Massachusetts, and Thetford, Vermont. $10,000 to Kane's Arctic Expedition. $10,000 to different sanitary fairs. $10,000 to unpaid monies advanced to uphold the credit of states. $40,000 total. $8,470,000. The life of such a man affords lessons full of hope and encouragement to others. In 1856, when on a visit to Danvers, now named Peabody, in honor of him, its most distinguished son and greatest benefactor, he said, "Though Providence has granted me an unvaried and unusual success in the pursuit of fortune in other lands, I am still in heart the humble boy who left yonder unpretending dwelling. There is not a youth within the sound of my voice whose early opportunities and advantages are not very much greater than were my own, and I have since achieved nothing that is impossible to the most humble boy among you." 2. Capitalists. Chapter 9. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Staten Island lies in the beautiful Bay of New York, 7 miles distant from the great city. Its lofty heights shut in the snug anchorage of the inner bay, and protect it from the rude storms which howl along the coast. It lies full in sight of the city, and is one of the most beautiful and attractive of its suburbs. The commanding heights and embowered shores are covered with villas and cottages, and afford a pleasant and convenient summer resort for the people of New York. It now contains a large and flourishing population, and maintains a speedy and constant communication with the metropolis by means of steam ferryboats, the total travel on which sometimes reaches as many as 10,000 or 12,000 passengers per day. 76 years ago, Staten Island was a mere country settlement, and its communications with the city were maintained by means of a few sailboats, which made one trip each way per day. One of these boats was owned and navigated by Cornelius Vanderbilt, a thriving farmer who owned a small but well-cultivated estate on Staten Island, near the present quarantine grounds. He was a man of exemplary character, great industry, and was generally regarded as one of the most prudent and reliable men on the island. Having a considerable amount of produce to sell in the city, he purchased a boat of his own for the purpose of transporting it thither. Frequently, residents of the island would secure passage in this boat to the city in the morning, and return with it in the evening. He realized a considerable sum of money in this way, and finally ran his boat regularly between the island and the city. This was the beginning of the New York and Staten Island ferry. Mr. Vanderbilt, by close application to his farm and boat, soon acquired a property, which, though small, was sufficient to enable him to maintain his family independently. His wife was a woman of more than usual character, and aided him nobly in making his way in the world. This admirable couple were blessed with 9 children. The oldest of these, Cornelius, the subject of this sketch, was born at the old farmhouse on Staten Island, on the 27th of May, 1794. He was a healthy, active boy, fond of all manner of outdoor sports, and manifesting an unusual repugnance to the confinement and labors of the schoolroom. He has since declared that the only books he remembers using at school were the New Testament and the spelling book. The result was that he merely learned to read, write, and cipher, and that imperfectly. He was passionately fond of the water and was never so well pleased as when his father allowed him to assist in sailing his boat. He was also a famous horseman from his earliest childhood, and even now recalls with evident pride the fact that when but 6 years old he rode a racehorse at full speed. When he set himself to accomplish anything, he was not, like most boys, deterred by the difficulties of his undertaking, but persevered until success crowned his efforts. So early did he establish his reputation for overcoming obstacles, that his boyish friends learned to regard any task which he undertook as already virtually performed. When he was only 12 years old, his father contracted to remove the cargo from a ship which had gone ashore near Sandy Hook, and to convey it to New York. The lighters which were to carry the goods to the city could not reach the ship, and it was necessary to haul the cargo, transported in wagons, across the sands from the vessel to them. In spite of his tender age, little Cornelius was placed by his father in charge of the undertaking, which he accomplished promptly and successfully. He loaded his lighters, sent them up to New York, and then started for home with his wagons. Upon reaching South Amboy, where he was to cross over to Staten Island, he found himself, with his wagons, horses, and men, without any money to pay his ferriage across to the island. The ferriage would amount to $6, and how he was to raise this sum he was, for a time, at a loss to determine. Finally, he went to the keeper of the tavern, to whom he was a stranger, and asked for the loan of $6, offering to leave one of his horses as a pledge for the money, which he promised to return within 2 days. The tavern keeper was so well pleased with the boy's energy that he loaned him the money, and the party crossed over to Staten Island. The pawned horse was promptly redeemed. Young Vanderbilt was always anxious to become a sailor, and, as he approached his 17th year, he determined to begin life as a boatman in the harbor of New York. On the 1st of May, 1810, he informed his mother of his determination, and asked her to lend him $100 to buy a boat. The good lady had always opposed her son's wish to go to sea, and regarded this new scheme as equally harebrained. As a means of discouraging him, she told him if he would plow, harrow, and plant with corn a certain 10-acre lot belonging to the farm, by the 27th of that month, on which day he would be 17 years old, she would lend him the money. The field was the worst in the whole farm. It was rough, hard, and stony, but by the appointed time the work was done, and well done, and the boy claimed and received his money. He hurried off to a neighboring village, and bought his boat, in which he set out for home. He had not gone far, however, when the boat struck a sunken wreck, and filled so rapidly that the boy had barely time to get into shoal water before it sank. Undismayed at this mishap, says Mr. Parton, from whose graphic memoir the leading incidents of this sketch are taken, he began his new career. His success, as we have intimated, was speedy and great. He made $1,000 during each of the next 3 summers. Often he worked all night, but he was never absent from his post by day, and he soon had the cream of the boating business of the port. At that day parents claimed the services and earnings of their children till they were 21. In other words, families made common cause against the common enemy, want. The arrangement between this young boatman and his parents was that he should give them all his day earnings and half his night earnings. He fulfilled his engagement faithfully until his parents released him from it, and with his own half of his earnings by night, he bought all his clothes. He had 40 competitors in the business, who, being all grown men, could dispose of their gains as they chose, but of all the 40, he alone has emerged to prosperity and distinction. Why was this? There were several reasons. He soon became the best boatman in the port. He attended to his business more regularly and strictly than any other. He had no vices. His comrades spent at night much of what they earned by day, and when the winter suspended their business, instead of living on their last summer's savings, they were obliged to lay up debts for the next summer's gains to discharge. In those 3 years of willing servitude to his parents, Cornelius Vanderbilt added to the family's common stock of wealth, and gained for himself 3 things: a perfect knowledge of his business, habits of industry and self-control, and the best boat in the harbor. During the War of 1812, young Vanderbilt was kept very busy. All the harbor defenses were fully manned, and a number of war vessels were in port all the time. The travel between these and the city was very great, and boatmen were in demand. In September 1813, a British fleet attempted to run past Fort Richmond during a heavy gale. The commanding officer was anxious to send to New York for reinforcements, but it was blowing so hard that none of the old boatmen were willing to venture upon the bay. They all declared that if the voyage could be made at all, Cornelius Vanderbilt was the only man who could make it. The commandant at once sent for the young man, who, upon learning the urgency of the case, expressed his belief that he could carry the messengers to the city. "But," said he, "I shall have to carry them part of the way under water." He set out with the messengers, and in an hour landed them safe, but drenched through, at the foot of Whitehall Street, which was then the landing place of all the boatmen of the harbor. He was now so prosperous in his calling that he determined to marry. He had wooed and won the heart of Sophia Johnson, the daughter of a neighbor, and he now asked his parents' consent to his marriage, and also requested them to allow him to retain his own earnings, in order that he might be able to support a wife. Both of his petitions received the approval of his parents, and in the winter of 1813 he was married. His wife was a woman of unusual personal beauty and strength of character, and proved the best of partners. He has often declared since that he owed his success in life as much to her counsel and assistance as to his own efforts. In the spring of 1814, it became known in America that the British were fitting out a formidable military and naval expedition for the purpose of attacking one of the Atlantic ports of the United States. The whole coast was on the lookout, and, as it was feared that the blow would be struck at New York, every precaution was taken to be ready. The militia were called into service for 3 months, under a heavy penalty for refusing to obey the call. The term of service thus marked out covered the most prosperous season of the boatmen, and made the call fall particularly hard upon them. About this time,